Finally.
Chills.
So, with the announcement of Steel Ball Run's anime adaptation being a thing, I think now is a great time to drop a compilation video of all the Jojo vids I've done in the past. Mainly because 1, I love Jojo and its villains, and 2, one of the greatest requests I've gotten in these videos to talk about the President of the United States, Funny Valentine. I'm proud of being American, Mr. President. Now, part of the reason why I haven't done one on him is mainly because of an editing and aesthetic issue. It's easier to me to have clips of an anime rather than screenshots when I talk about my points. Plus, having voice clips to highlight key moments is always a plus to me, whether subbed or dubbed. So, trust me, once this anime drops, you can expect to see Funny Valentine in my thumbnail style popping up on your feed. But for now, compilation time! Disclaimer, this video contains all the videos I've done on JoJo villains. That includes basically the audio, the visuals, there's going to be some dated stuff in there, so if I look different, don't read too much into it. And they're also done in the order they were released. I mean, you look at the views on the Yoshikage Kira video I did a while ago, and you tell me I didn't make the right call starting with the guy who fetishized the Mona Lisa's hands. In any case, I'm MangaKamen, and enjoy.
You can call me Yoshikage Kira. I'm currently 33 years old. Not that you'd care, but I reside in Northeast Morio's Villa District. Also, I've yet to marry. If I were ever to engage in combat, I would win the battle without question.
I think when it comes to villains in media nowadays, there tends to be a lot of trends that take away from the villainous nature of the characters. This isn't a new topic on my channel. It's part of the reason why I wanted to make videos talking about villains, rivals, etc. in media. More specifically video games, but I'm obviously going to branch out if this video's thumbnail and title doesn't give it away. One of these days, I'm going to make a full video about my issues with modern day villains writing. Which, hey, if you guys are ever interested, let me know. But enough of my shilling. I think it says a lot that one of the more intriguing elements to villains is how much of a threat they are, and how they are actually treated as a threat in their own story. It's part of the reason why I was drawn to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Like, you can probably point to a lot of issues with the series, and I've got my own criticisms, but one of the most attractive aspects of the series is the villains. The villains are probably some of the best that fiction can offer, whether it be their designs, their over-the-top personalities, their powers, or even just their character in and of itself. Of course, there's going to be a lot of debate and disagreement on who is and isn't the best villain. A lot of people attribute... Oh, right. I guess spoilers? I mean, we're talking about a particular villain in this video and his name and face is in the title and thumbnail, so you're really coming to a video to complain about spoilers? Of course they are. They always are. I should also say that while I will talk about some aspects of Kira, I do expect you guys to have some knowledge of the JoJo franchise, not just part 4, mind you. Regardless, today we're talking about Yoshikage Kira. Now, whether or not you think he's the best villain in JoJo, I'm not here to argue that. That's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to analyze Kira and talk about why he's an effective villain, especially in today's modern media. I say this because while we did get the animated version of JoJo Diamond is Unbreakable in 2016, 7 years ago, ugh, I'm old. The original manga for this part of JoJo ran from 1992 to 1995, so technically speaking, Kira's an older villain before the turn of the century. And during that time, well, you could get away with a lot more than what the more modern writers and villains could. Like getting off to the Mona Lisa's hands. God, I hope my neighbors didn't hear me when I said that. But here's a question. Who is Yoshikage Kira?
I'm currently 33 years old. Not that you'd care, but I reside in Northeast Morio's Villa District. Also, I've yet to marry. In order to make a living, I work for Kamen department stores. After a long day's work, I return home no later than 8 p.m. I don't like smoking, but do enjoy the occasional drink. I'm always in bed by 11 p.m., and I make it a point to get no less than 8 hours of sleep each night.
If that little monologue seemed to be a bit too mundane to you, that's because that's the point. On the surface, Yoshikage Kira is a normal man who wants to live a normal, quiet life, free from the worries that life can bring. Oh, and indulge in his... Yeah, Kira is a serial killer, one who's been doing his dirty deeds for decades in Morio, and until 1999 he had been successful, for the most part, and due in part to his stand ability, Killer Queen. It's an interesting change of pace for the Jojo characters in the prior parts, specifically the villains. Unlike Dio and the Pillarmen, who had much more grandiose desires, Kira is a much more down-to-earth villain. He's not looking to take over the world, he is not interested in becoming stronger, and honestly, once we get to the second half of the series, the chase after him is quite intriguing, but I'll go more in depth with that later. To make a bit of a long story short, Kira has one simple goal in life: to live a quiet one, to avoid confrontation and again indulge in his vices. Kira tends to be a bit more tame and subdued, especially when, say, compared to Dio. With a few exceptions, like when he's certain that he'll win, he tends to be calm, cool, and collected. And when he does break out into the hamminess, it tends to be done in a more outlandish and terrifying manner. It's also thanks to the voice acting that helps sell this. I know I just used the original Japanese for that clip, but I also want to take a moment and note the English dub voice actor. I know there's quite a bit of a contrast between subs and dubs, but in all honesty, I do appreciate the English dub. Especially Kira, who is voiced by DC Douglas, which, if you're not familiar with, is one of the more prominent roles would be Wesker from Resident Evil.
I don't need anyone else. I have big balls.
The way he portrays Kira as a regular person really does fit, but also has this floating dread in the voice work that sells whatever Kira says as a very demented person. I just want to bring attention to the excellent voice work in both versions of the show. Hell, I really do enjoy the English dub for Part 4 overall, because there's a lot of fun moments and execution for the series is really good.
For the love of God, drop the meat!
I also want to draw attention to Kira's design. Now, there's a lot of influence of David Bowie in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I just realized I live in a world where a lot of people probably don't know who David Bowie is. God, that Reaper is inching ever so closer to me with every passing second. I can almost feel the scythe on my neck. David Bowie, aka David Robert Jones, was an English singer, songwriter, and actor who was regarded as one of the most iconic musicians of the 20th century. Thank you, Google! He was a really interesting musician who basically reinvented visual presentation and stagecraft. The guy clearly had an impact on the musical world, and the guy had a very impressive career while he was alive. And considering that Araki, the author of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, has a fascination with music, as shown with all the direct musical references to characters and stands: Vanilla Ice, Crazy Diamond, REO Speedwagon, King Crimson, Foo Fighters, Weather Report, Costello, friggin' Dio! I'm just saying, it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility for Araki to take influence for character design from an actual person who had a major effect on the musical world. More notably, Kira takes influence from the Thomas Jerome Newton persona from The Man Who Fell on Earth film, which David Bowie played. Kira is blonde with blue eyes. He dresses in regular formal suits. Well, regular in the world of JoJo, especially when comparison to everyone else's clothing in the main cast. It adds to his aesthetic and main goal of wanting to live a quiet life and not stand out, while still maintaining his facade of a normal guy so he couldn't be ripped away from... Let's talk about Kira's power. Killer Queen.
Deadly Queen.
Doesn't have the same ring. For those who aren't familiar with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I apologize if you aren't, stands are manifestations of a person's soul, each with their own unique abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. Granted, every stand has a use. It's just that some tend to be more suitable for combat, others for tricks, and others for traps. Strength and weakness don't really apply for how a stand can be utilized. Kira's Killer Queen is a powerful stand with its ability to turn anything it touches into a bomb, blow up anything, and not leave anything behind. It's a handy ability and one that works for Kira's advantage, as he doesn't want to leave any evidence behind of his crimes. Well, save for...
It soothes my soul and brings relief to my restless spirit.
But then again, he can make the hand fizzle away at any time he wants as well. And while Killer Queen is a strong stand against other combat-oriented stands like Jotaro Kujo's Star Platinum or Josuke's Crazy Diamond, it lacks raw power. However, Killer Queen has additional abilities that play to Kira's strength. Sheer Heart Attack is a remote stand that can operate independently from Kira and also provide a bomb attack. It's also near invincible, but can only attack things with heat signatures. It's a powerful stand, but also has limitations to it as well. Then we get to Killer Queen's third bomb, Bites the Dust, a very powerful ability that Kira can imbue into another person, and should anyone try to learn Kira's identity, it activates. It blows up the person who learns the secret, then creates a temporal loop for the person who is being infected with it, and returns the host back to about an hour before the bomb goes off. To make it clear, Kira gets this in the later half of the series, and after he goes into hiding as another character, Kosaku Kawajiri. Right, should probably bring that up here as well. After a run-in with Jotaro Kujo and Koichi Hirose, along with Josuke Nokuyasu appearing soon after the fight, Kira had to go into hiding. He did this by utilizing another stand user's ability to steal a face from another person, Kosaku Kawajiri, and thus he was able to hide away. During this time as Kosaku, Kira had to deal with not only becoming a totally different person, but also had to hide his murderous tendencies. As we learned through the investigations from the protagonists, we learned that Kira is a creature of habit, and has a weird tick that is tied to his murdering desire. The longer that Kira goes without killing someone, the faster his nails grow. And as they grow rather long and have been quite a bit, to the point where he makes it a hobby of his to collect the clippings in small jars. Yeah, I know, it's Jojo. You gotta expect this kind of weird. And during this time while Kira was hiding as Kosaku, the longer his nails grew, the more that his desire to reveal the real Yoshikage Kira to some girl grew as well. In case it wasn't apparent, Yoshikage Kira is a demented serial killer, under the guise of a normal person, but will kill plenty of women and take their left hands as his girlfriends, preserving them until they begin to rot. That is Yoshikage Kira. As I've said, Kira is a more down-to-earth villain, and it works with this part. And this is a personal aspect, but one of the many reasons why Part 4 is one of my favorite parts of JoJo is that there's a stark contrast to the previous part. Part 3 was essentially a around the world in 80 days adventure, and Part 4 was a more down-to-earth feel with the localized location of Morio. The previous villain, Dio, was a 100-year-old vampire, and meanwhile, Kira, for all intents and purposes, is just a random person who got lucky, has a little cunning, and of course a powerful stand that allows him to indulge in his vices quite easily. The element here is, well, human. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate Dio and the Pillarmen, they are excellent villains in of themselves, but Dio had rejected his humanity and the Pillarmen weren't human. Kira is just a human with a stand, mind you, but he doesn't have any real aspirations and willingness to take over the world. If anything, that also plays in the element of Part 4, since his mundanity of just living in Morio gives a bit more of a creep factor to the villain because he just blends in. Like, if you look at a character like Dio or Cars, they're very iconic, but their designs are very outlandish and they tend to be very boastful for their desires so everyone can be aware of their intentions. In contrast, you've got Kira, a serial killer who could be anyone in town of Morio. Hell, the town in and of itself doesn't even know that there are serial killings going on because of Kira's ability to blow the people into nothing. If you really consider it, if the plot of Part 4 worked for our protagonists, Kira could have just killed off countless young women in Morio and nobody would be aware of it. Whereas, if you got the more exuberant villains who stand out, the point of Kira is to blend in with the crowd. He comes off as mundane and uninteresting, even to the point where as a kid he didn't stand out too far and came in a lot of competitions in third place so he wouldn't stand out. A face in the crowd, as it were. We live in a large world, and it's easy for people to see who are in the spotlight and determine whether or not they're good or bad people. But the people in the street? Well, they're a mystery as to who they really are. You never know what masks people wear when they're in public, and who they really are in private. It's the unknown, and that's a good element for a villain, because on the surface, they are living a charade to hide the true self, to be a mundane and uninteresting so he couldn't stand out and draw the attention of others, all the while hiding his true form. And that is what a true monster is. Kira's design also adds to this. Sure, Kira's a handsome man, but doesn't really stand out from the rest of the cast in Part 4. If you were to compare Kira to a lot of the other character designs, they did have a lot more outrageous elements, and make them stand out. For example, Josuke's got his hair and pins on his uniform, Okuyasu... Or Rohan's hair and accessories. Kira's design is rather plain, especially for Jojo standards. The most he gets is a killer queen tie, and it isn't until he acquires Bites the Dust that his hair changes into a more drastic and unique styling. Before he gets the boost to his stand, Kira tends to be a lot more stoic and less really enraged. It's what really made Kira stand out as an antagonist in Jojo, since I've been saying he only has one goal: to live a quiet life. And funny enough, Kira does get what he wants when he changes his face and becomes Kosaku. He got everything an every average person wants. He's got a home, a job, a family. There's just one problem. That's not his life. He can no longer be Yoshikage Kira. He has to take the life that he stole and leave Kira locked up in a cage within himself. And that's hell for him. You watch as Kira slowly begins to grow more and more unsettled. All because he can't contain his vices, his habits, his desire to show the real Yoshikage Kira to someone.
We're all forced to live out our lives concealing our deepest hopes and fears. But to forever keep them to yourself, can one truly live out their days behind such a veil of secrecy?
For all extents and purposes, Kira has what he's always wanted, a quiet life. But it's not his, and it burns him up inside that he has to control his urges. And you can't help but watch, holding your breath as you see him edge closer and closer to reverting to his true self.
Do it. Bare your heart to her. Show her your true self. Yoshikage Kira.
The funny thing is, if Kira didn't kill people, he could easily have his quiet life. And here's the thing, Kira doesn't have a traditional tragic backstory. If anything, he was a spoiled brat, and even in death, Kira's father was willing to allow his murderous son to keep up with his terrible tendencies, creating a monster in the process. If you were to say compare Kira to Dio and their backstories, Dio was living in squalor and an abusive household, having to gamble over chess games to earn any sort of money. It was a life that turned Dio into a bitter person who was willing to throw away his humanity due to how crappy humanity had treated him in turn. Meanwhile, Kira is essentially a spoiled brat. Kira's family was well off, and he essentially got a full-on home when his parents passed away when he was younger. And when he got his stand, Kira was capable of indulging in his murderous vice and being able to easily eliminate his targets without any evidence that could lead the police to him. Both characters are terrible people, and that monsters can be created from anywhere, and that even spoiled brats, those being handed anything they want at a young age, can be just as bad. It's a message that shows that parents do need to set boundaries and not allow their kids just do what they want. Bit of an extreme case, I'll admit, but it's still a message to consider, especially since Kira can be a very entitled person, wanting a quiet life but willing to snuff out any young woman's life who catches Kira's eyes. While it's not the traditional tragedy that we're used to, it's still tragic in a means that Kira's fetish that had a mundane start, but his parents did nothing to really help their kid as he got worse and worse. If anything, Kira's father Yoshihiro pampered Kira, and that in turn turned him into an entitled serial killer. Enabling is another form of neglect since it isn't actually nurturing a kid. Which leads us into the next section. Now, as a villain, you need to make them a threat to the protagonist, cause if they aren't a threat, then what's even the point? Well, you wouldn't be a villain, you'd be a joke. So in order to be a productive villain, you need to be able to establish a threat to the main cast, because if there's no stakes that the villain creates, again, what's the point? For Kira, we got a few ways as to how he's a threat. The mystery of who he is, where he is, and his versatility with his abilities. The first two go hand in hand. If you're looking at the anime version of the part, we're introduced to a severed hand that breaks up the mundane morning and the colorful setting of Morio. This shows the audience that there's a dark shadow looming over the regular town, and it's one that the normal folks are completely unaware of. An evil that you're not aware of is one that really works well, especially in a narrative. We're told of him when the cast meets the ghost of Kira's first victim, Remy. After that, the crew actually comes across Kira incidentally.
Now take a deep breath. He's managed to avoid the police for over a decade, and they're supposed to be the best. It's not like we're gonna summon him like waving down some taxi by force of will alone. Let's stay calm and take things slowly and carefully. So, what did old Rohan have to say?
He said the same thing as you, Josuke.
Be careful, Koichi! You have to be alert when you cross the road!
I'm sorry for the trouble.
Of course, they don't know Kira's the culprit. They just think he's another person in Morio. But that to me speaks of how dangerous Kira is, that you can be so close to a monster and not even realize it. It's really the unknown factor that plays a key role into this killer of a character. Of course, we need to discuss the other reason for his threat level, his versatility with his abilities. Killer Queen on its own is a powerful stand. Like, when used properly, I think it'd be argued to be a very potent one as well. It doesn't have the ability to stop time, erase time, or see the future. Rather, it has the ability to turn anything, living or inanimate, into a bomb, all with a single touch. Said bombs don't seem to affect the environment, and despite the loud sound effects, are apparently silent to people. I mean, if they weren't, then that kinda would announce to the world that
Tactical nuke incoming!
But all in all, it's a terrifying stand that can be extremely deadly, especially since it can vaporize people within seconds when the bomb goes off, even more so when Kira can turn the bombs to be detonated at will or have them be triggered. Granted, this ability has a few weaknesses to it. If Kira or Killer Queen cannot press their thumb against their index finger's middle phalanx to trigger the bomb's detonation, the target cannot blow up. The bombs have similar properties to incendiary bombs, which means that they require air to be used, and only one bomb can be made at a time. Even with these limitations, Kira is able to make use of the ability. After all, most of the time, part of the strategy in Jojo is understanding the capabilities of stand users. And anything being a bomb is something that most people wouldn't be able to plan against, and if they do, it'd be more paranoia being a factor, as anything could be turned into a bomb that could kill you almost instantly. Kira's other ability, Sheer Heart Attack, is a branch off Killer Queen, acting as a remote stand that has a similar ability, and although it's near invincible, it isn't the greatest automaton, where it can only track heat sources and attack them. Then there's Bites the Dust. I've already explained it, and considering that this ability can be only undone if Kira removes Killer Queen from its host or if Kira dies, it's a very powerful ability. Later on in the final fight against the Jojo the part Josuke, we see Kira use another stand user, Stray Cat, to turn invisible air bubbles into floating bombs. This shows that Kira can think on his feet and use any advantage that he can. Then again, even as a villain outside of combat, Kira has also been shown to be an analytical person. He's able to think on his feet rather quickly. For example, cutting off his hand in order to have Sheer Heart Attack go wild and act as a decoy so he can escape. Granted, backfired since Josuke's crazy diamond ability to recombine the hand to Kira happened and led them to him, but even that worked in Kira's favor, since the person losing a hand can be a signifier to lead people to find Kira even after he changed his face. Back to my point, Kira is also a threat as we see him use his power against a powerful stand user, Shigechi, Kira being able to outsmart and kill him in the span of 5 minutes. And we managed to establish Kira as a threatening villain, just like that. Of course, when you have a villain, you also need a hero to face against said villain. And some of the best heroes versus villain dynamics also make sure that both parties have a clear opposition between the two of them. This can be done as simple as conflicting designs, like, for example, having a character wearing red fighting a character wearing blue, going with the blue Oni red Oni trope. Or their abilities are conflicting with each other even though they do have similar sets as well. It can be something as simple as using a similar weapon. And the same can be said for the main character of Jojo Part 4, Josuke Higashikata. I will say, one of the biggest criticisms that I have with Part 4 is that Josuke sometimes falls out of the wayside of being the main character in his own part. I'm not saying that he gets shafted the whole way, mind you, he still has a lot of awesome moments. God, I still love that scene being animated years later. But there was a bit of an oddity of part 4 with Josuke as the main character, and one that I do hope to make a video about, because I do like Josuke as a main character, but he does have his flaws in his own story, and if you're interested, please consider typing in the comments, Crazy Diamond! And if we get about 10k likes on this video, I'll make a video talking about Josuke as a character in the future videos. But for the purposes of this one, if we compare Josuke and Kira's designs, you can already see that their design work, they do oppose each other. Josuke's color palette is much darker with his outfit and hair, meanwhile Kira's blonde hair and lavender suit bring this into as well. They're conflicting color designs due to how their brightness and darkness works. Hell, the designs themselves can also do this too, since Josuke's design in and of itself is that of a Yankee, basically a Japanese delinquent, and as such is seen as a troublemaker and a stain on society. In opposition, Kira's clean-cut suit and his job as a salaryman make him out to be a respectable Japanese member of society. Of course, we as the audience know this is to be the opposite. You also have to consider their abilities. I'm not going to rehash for a third time about Kira's abilities, but for the sake of brevity, I will with Josuke's. Josuke's Crazy Diamond is a very combat-focused stand, having some very powerful physical abilities to it, such as strength, speed, and precision. But it also has a secondary ability, Restoration.
Crazy Diamond!
It's an ability that allows Josuke to do quite a variety of things, but to put it simply, Josuke has the ability to repair organisms and objects. This can also revert chemical changes or turn things back to their base components. And if you're like, Angelo, you get turned into a rock. I'm sure with that description, you can see how this ability is diametrically opposed to Kira's. Kira's ability is all about destruction. Meanwhile, Josuke's ability is about repairing. The two characters are essentially direct oppositions to each other, and when the two do meet in the final confrontation in the part, the battle between them is a real nail-biter. Not only because both of the users use their stand abilities in very creative ways, but also because their fighting styles actually clash very well. Getting back to how they use their stand abilities in creative ways, Kira using the aforementioned air bubbles to attack Josuke from a distance, and Josuke uses his own blood to shoot glass tracking bombs to get Kira from a long range as well. It's all the more satisfying to watch Josuke land blows. Of course, I've got my criticisms of that too, but that's for another video. Remember, 10k likes. In any case, even when he bites the dust, this dichotomy between Kira and Josuke makes more sense, especially since Kira's outfit and hair go to pure white at this point. Well, save for the black streaks, but you get the point. And frankly, I kinda wish we had more confrontations between Josuke and Kira, because when you think about it, they do have a good hero and villain dynamic going on here with these design elements. But I'm sure there's a question on everyone's mind right about now, after watching everything that I said in this video.
Okay, but why though?
I make it no secret that I love talking about villains on this channel. Hell, rivals too, and I'm hoping to expand more into character archetypes and subtypes in the near future. But to propose the question again, why is Kira a good villain? It's because he doesn't fall into the same trappings a lot of other modern day villains have, and he breaks the mold for what a lot of Jojo villains were up to this point. I've already extensively explained that Kira as a villain in comparison to the major antagonists in Jojo is different, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But what do I mean with the breaking of trappings of modern day villains? Despite the fact that Jojo Part 4's initial manga run between 1992 and 1995, the official anime adaptation came out in 2016, 7 years ago. Kira's model of a villain is reminiscent of the 90s elements because he was from that time period, and it shows. The guy is a psychopath. He doesn't have the traditional tragic backstory. He has style, he has his own goals, and most of all, he comes off as an actual person. What I mean to say is that he has flaws. His entitled attitude as a character has clearly given the guy a superiority complex, as demonstrated when he underestimated Jotaro Kujo when he was wounded. And then... or when he believes that he outsmarted Hayato and allowed his ego to get the better of him, that he proclaimed his name, allowing Josuke to hear it. These are idiotic aspects to Kira, but that's also the point. Kira isn't some vampire chess master, nor is he a battle-hardened warrior like the Pillarmen were. He was a spoiled brat. And here's the thing, while that was his major weakness, it wasn't used as a joke. A lot of villains nowadays are made to be incompetent, or they do things that are so absurdly stupid that it makes you wonder how they even succeeded at being a villain in the first place.
I'm going to leave them alone and not actually witness them dying. I'm just going to assume it all went to plan. What?
Kira isn't a perfect human, and it's his ego that gets the better of him, but he still had a lot of moments of competency and was a real threat. He isn't made into a joke character, he's an actual threat, and the chase after him is an actual goal that you can root for. It also reflects how Kira is a villain. His strength comes from his ability to hide in the shadows, even reflected in his abilities, creating a bomb from an unknown object, using the long-range sheer heart attack, and even bites the dust to hide his current identity from the people chasing after him. These are abilities that allow Kira to not actually fight directly against people, and despite his words to Shigechi,
Of course, if I were ever to engage in combat, I would win the battle without question.
it's reflective of a cowardly narcissist, and it's reflective in his abilities, actions, and behavior. It's a rarity to see such a villain like that in modern day, and frankly, Kira isn't a modern day villain. As stated, he's from the 90s, and it shows. He's a disgusting human being, and for a villain, that's great. I've talked about good and bad villains for a while, and frankly, I believe that Kira is something that a lot of villains nowadays should be. Absolute scum, but with a misleading outer shell. Powerful, but not perfect. Have flaws, but not have the flaws override his high points of being a villain. And of course, his death is iconic for this, because he dies twice. Kira gets the ending that he deserves, with his first victim getting her revenge, and Kira being dragged to hell, where he can never have a quiet existence. It's something that a lot of villains kinda deserve nowadays. But a lot of villains either get redemption, or their deaths are less impactful. And Kira's death? It's satisfying. Yoshikage Kira is a good villain. He fits with the smaller, localized setting of Morio. He has an amazing power that fits for not only his desires, but also his character and representation as such. But he's also just entertaining. Now, whether you agree with me or not, that's up to you. I'm sure that people will probably say that in comparison to other Jojo villains, Kira is lacking, and perhaps you're right. I'm not going to pretend that Kira's writing is perfect. Trust me, I don't think that he's a perfect villain, just that he's a villain that's done right. But regardless, I want to thank everyone who watched this video, and hopefully we can do more videos like this where we talk about villains specifically. I'm still working on the AI character video, so expect that next month, and thanks again for watching. I'm MangaKamen, and remember...
At that time, I was very weak. Lacking a body made me vulnerable. If I had not taken Jonathan Joestar's body, if it hadn't been for his energy to augment my own limited source, I couldn't have survived at the bottom of that ocean for 100 years.
I have a confession to make. I love villains. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone coming back to this channel. Hell, probably some of my favorite videos have been delving into the insanity of villains. And I like villains as they can come in many different shapes, sizes, shades, and some other word that begins with a letter S that escapes my brain at the moment. A few months ago, I talked about one of my favorite villains, Yoshikage Kira. He's probably one of my favorite villains in Jojo, not counting the future antagonists in the manga that haven't been adapted yet. He's also what a lot of villains should strive to be as well, and probably one of the better villains in media. And yet, I wouldn't say he's the most iconic villains in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. No, that would go to the one, the only, Dio. To make it clear, I'm talking about this Dio, not this Dio. This one, not this one. Yes! No. We good? Good. I'm MangaKamen, and...
Are you ready to rock, boys and girls? I said, are you ready to rock?
Dio Brando, the man, the myth, the legend. But who is Dio? Well, to be frank, he's probably one of the most iconic villains in all of anime and manga, and he happens to be what a lot of villains should strive to be as well. Dio has this charm to him. He's over the top. He actually manages to be a threat, extremely entertaining, and even after his canonical death in the series, his legacy still managed to affect it afterwards, and even influenced pop culture for years. Damn these memes, but they were still influential on the internet and certainly drew more people to Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. Before I actually get into the canonical origins of Dio from a story perspective and why he's a great villain, I want to take some time and talk about Araki's choices when it came to creating Dio. According to the interviews in the Jojoium with Araki, he took inspiration from FBI profiling of serial killers, pointing out that they need to have a level of strength in order to commit the heinous crimes that they do. It should also be known that Araki also looked towards serial killers who controlled their victims through psychological manipulation, a similar ability that Dio himself showcases throughout the series. How he's able to really tempt those who work for him, scare other people, and of course, playing mind games with other characters. FBI psychological profiling was a hot topic around the time that I wrote this. Why do serial killers do what they do, scientifically speaking? I was inspired by that when I was working on Dio. Guys like that are true scumbags, rotten to the core, yet I've always sort of thought that they are actually incredibly strong for being able to commit such crimes. Why do they go so far? Do they do it just to see if they can? The control aspect of it interests me as well. Dio's physical appearance was taken from pop culture. In this case, the character Roy Batty from the Blade Runner movie, the 1982 version, the good one. This is in line with a lot of Araki's works of inspiration, taking things from pop culture and retooling them for his work. As I've said before, he did the same thing with Kira, and in one of the many interviews that Araki gave, he said the following about Dio. I mentioned this back when I was talking about Jonathan, but Dio was actually the one I want to draw the most for part 1. How far can a man's ambition drive him when he takes it to the ultimate extreme? One of Araki's goals with Dio was to showcase just how far a person was willing to go for their ambitions, even going so far as to throw away their humanity and kicking a dog.
Ready, Ike? Kick the baby! Don't kick the baby. Kick the baby.
And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You've probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. You know, that whole thing. But when it comes to Dio, that phrase is bullshit! Dio as a character is someone who, while having reasons for his actions, he doesn't apologize, he gives no excuses, and he'll gladly give you a smile, all before he throws a knife at your throat. There's just something about seeing a character who smiles a lot, whether that smile is for good or bad purposes, that makes you want to like them, even if they happen to be a psychopath. Araki loved to draw Dio. You can see that with every panel that he shows the character, and Dio is a visually appealing and interesting person. Dio's also a guy who will just sip wine as one of his lackeys just casually cuts his own head off at Dio's request. But now that we've got a good idea of who Dio is, let's talk about how Dio is.
Shall be the key. Now burn!
Born in the year of 1869 on the cold streets of London, Dio, as a young man, was raised for the first 10 years of his life by his abusive, drunk father, Dario, and even lived through the death of his own mother. This is pretty much all we really know about Dio's past from the manga and anime. Aside from the fact that he earned money by playing chess, Araki has also stated that he doesn't like to go too in-depth with villains suffering while showing their backstory, since, well, they're the bad guys, and logically speaking, the heroes do need to defeat them after all. It wouldn't do too good for the villains to become overly sympathetic for the character that is supposed to be defeated by the heroes. However, from what clues we are given by Araki's illustrations and writing, we can glean some information that's below the surface. Take, for example, the first sentence I said in this section. Yeah, that one where I was a dork trying to be overly dramatic. Even the setting that I gave, the time and place can give us an idea into the backstory of Dio, as well as his motivations in part 1, and even going further into the future where parts where Dio is still alive in. Year 1867 coincidentally lines up with the Reform Act of the same year, where it was essentially a time where classism and the right to vote in the working class was null. This was a time and country where classism and obviously living conditions that weren't the greatest for those in the lower classes existed. Considering the context that we're given in both the anime and manga, we can see that Dio wasn't really all that respectable and probably lived more on the streets. And with an abusive father, we can really see the beginnings of a broken young man. Oddly enough, Dio does showcase a lot of signs of abuse victims. Not to claim I'm some sort of psychologist on the internet like most YouTubers, but a quick Google search does show things such as destructiveness, low empathy, cruelty, and other assortments of the big-brained words that make the YouTuber look smarter than he actually is. Duh. Even considering the time period and location, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination that Dio grew to resent any and all those who are on a higher class than him. And it's that resentment that allowed Dio to essentially do whatever he could to escape his situation. In a sense, it's just the willingness to survive. And a cornered animal will do anything to survive. Dio as a child was broken down mentally and physically, and why he has such a misanthropic view on humanity, one that carries into his actions as he poisons his own father and by the grace of God or a devil, is brought into the Joestar family. Considering the background and upbringing, it wouldn't be any surprise that Dio would hate the Joestars. For all his life up to that point, Dio was suffering at the hands of fate, and the world dealing him a terrible hand. Meanwhile, Jonathan was given a privileged life. When Dio first meets up with Jonathan, the young blonde writes off Jojo as a spoiled rich brat. And he's not really wrong about that, since we are shown scenes of Jojo acting as such. Dio doesn't see another kid. He doesn't see someone who could potentially be a friend or a brother. He just sees a stepping stone on his path to the top. And incidentally, lashes out on Jojo in a similar vein as what Dio had experienced when he was a young kid at the hands of Dario. You better not act high and mighty just because I'm staying in your home. I don't let anyone swagger over me. I mean, Dio really doesn't know Jojo at this point. He doesn't know Jojo as a person or a character and doesn't make an effort to do so. If anything, this bleeds into Dio doing similar crimes against Jojo that Dario did. Only to an extent that's a little bit more. Killing Jojo's dog, intentionally trying to physically assault Jojo with dirty tricks, and of course...
It was I, Dio!
Ironically enough, it's a cycle of abuse that Dio was perpetuating. It was due to the inability to trust in people, and one that's not completely unfounded. Isolation makes a man hollow. Speaking from experience, are we, Dio? Dio got what a lot of people wouldn't be able to get, even in today's world. He got a second chance at a good life. Jojo and his father George were willing to take him in as one of their own family, but the scars of Dio's backstory pushed him to view those two as nothing more than the rich elites that looked down on him, even if they didn't actually do so. And unfortunately, eventually, something breaks. Honestly, one thing I need to point out with the manga, and in the place of the popular anime adaptation, is that the manga we get is a bit more defensive pose that Dio takes here. With his arms crossed, his tears a lot more prominent, and even seeing his body shaking, you can see that this really does affect Dio, that a spoiled brat that he had written off had just kicked his ass. It really solidifies in my mind that Dio was a broken young man who wanted to inflict the same pain that he had gotten onto someone else. And it's at this point that Dio changes. Inflicting this kind of pain wouldn't really work against someone who has proven that he is willing to fight back and can beat him down. Again, this is what I have managed to interpret from Dio. Backstory and actions do have on-scene information from them that allow me to infer more aspects of Dio's character in a more hypothetical standard. And I should point out that Araki's characterization still makes Dio to be a straight-up bastard, especially after the time skip in part 1, where Dio plays a bit more of a subtle game, switching his tactics to that of poisoning George in the same way he did with Dario. I think we should talk about George Joestar for a moment when it comes to Dio's backstory. It's actually rather important in regards to Dio. As stated before, Dio got a second chance at life, but the wounds from his former life and father certainly interfered with that aspect, even when there was a more, positive father figure in his life. I hesitated there for a sec because George is a different kind of bad father, not so much abusive or a drunkard, but because he was kind of blind to what Dio was doing, as well as using a switch on Jojo for getting a question wrong, and even starves Jojo over bad table manners. This did actually get Jojo into a prime mindset for Dio to take advantage of, but also take this thought into account. How would Dio ever respect another father, especially one who treated his own flesh and blood like this over things that are really that minor? With the phantom of Dario hanging over Dio's shoulders, it should be obvious that Dio would have a bad view of fathers especially. Hell, Dio even blamed Dario for the death of his own mother. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the scene where Dio was stumbling in the streets after Jojo discovered his plot of poisoning George, mirroring the alcoholism that Dario had. It's really interesting to consider that as much as Dio hates the blood of his own father that flows through his veins, and ironically enough, Dio inherited a lot what made him despise Dario. Got Dario's cruelty, his conniving nature. Remember, Dario was willing to rob a dead man at an accident. His sadism, his greed. Hell, if it wasn't because of fate, an actual thing in Jojo, mind you, Dio would have been in the exact same place as Dario had been, a drunk in the gutter. Now, all of this is a reason for why Dio does the things he does. However, they aren't an excuse. At least, not to an outside viewer like you or me. Or that one guy in the back. Down in front! Dio, though? Yes, he believes that his past of why he is the way he is, and that those who show him kindness haven't had a taste of his own life and are only for him to use. And Dio doesn't think of himself as a bad person. And I know what you're thinking, and typing down below, because that directly contradicts what I had said at the beginning of this video. What did I say again? And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. Oh yeah, that. And you'd be right. Except that, my friends, is basic humanity. But the Dio I'm referring to at the beginning... I reject my humanity! When Dio kills George, using his blood to awaken the power of the stone mask, that's the moment that Dio truly throws off the shackles of his past, his lies to everyone, and becomes an immortal vampire. There's a line that I honestly find intriguing from Speedwagon before this happens. He was born evil. Normally, I hate lines like this, mainly because it stems from the idea of nature versus nurture, where bad behavior is ingrained into a person's very essence and soul. Personally speaking, I believe no one is born evil or good, and that we enter this world as a blank slate. But enough of my moral grandstanding, the phrase actually describes what Dio does. If he was born evil, then there's no reason for him to keep his humanity. After all, if you were meant to be an evil person, you might as well not be human at the same time. And with his humanity now stripped from him, Dio can finally be free. He can be himself, and he can indulge into every vice and no longer make excuses for himself. After all, if he was born evil, he might as well go all out, right? Why not consider yourself top of the food chain? After all, from Dio's perspective, humanity has looked down upon him, and now humans have become his cattle. So obviously he's the superior life form, right? No one tell Dio about cars. There's a lot more to Dio that we can talk about, but we're specifically focusing on the past for this section, and to explain that while Dio does have a tragic past, the moment he discards his humanity, he discards his excuses for the things that he does. He removes his fears, and as such, he no longer needs to be chained down by his human nature, and become one of the most iconic characters throughout the series.
Again. Just now, a most intense feeling like someone somewhere is watching me.
I think he's talking to you.
As I've stated before in other videos, a villain needs to be able to be a threat to the heroes. And since Dio has about 2 different modus operandi in the 2 parts that he was actually alive, and had different abilities, I think we'll focus on that aspect. I alluded in the previous part that Dio often had to rely on his own intellect, and play a bit more coy with his goals of attaining the Joestar fortune. But all of that changed when he gave up his humanity. It's nearly impossible for a regular man to kill a vampire, at least in the world of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, at least a normal man. Not to say that Dio's own mental faculties were completely eliminated from when he became a vampire, but it was clear that his focus had changed to a bit more of a power focus. I mean, the guy could shoot pressurized jets of fluid that acted like high-pressured water cannons and could freeze people by the mere touch. He also had the ability to create zombies and then later full-on vampires so he could create more lackeys as he saw fit. There was a lot more egotism when Dio became a vampire, and it's obvious to see that when he came to his fights against Jonathan, it's what he calls anything that Jojo does.
It's useless, 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 useless!
Doesn't have the same sting of Muda Muda Muda, now does it? Still, when Dio does gain his vampiric powers, he essentially goes,
Don't care, didn't ask, cry about it, stay mad, get real, Elmald seed cope.
But as we all know... Of course, when he lost his body and became just a head, Dio had to resort to more backhanded tactics, and that still didn't work out too well for him, at least for 100 years. We then get to part 3 Dio. Well, in the timeline there's a fair bit where he spends time with Poochie, but that's not the point for this section. With a newly minted ass...
But he's got a nice... Yuri.
Dio had to hide more into the shadows while his body recovered, and as such had to rely more on outside help, with a new power from stand users, which was an ability that Dio also received when he was back in the world of the living. Funnily enough, the eye beams and the cold abilities were just gone. Granted, what Dio got in return more than makes up for it, but for those abilities to just disappear, especially since he could do the eye beams when he was still ahead, I'm just nitpicking at the moment though. Let's talk about Dio's stand power. There was a bit of a fan theory that I do want to bring up, and that's that Dio was supposed to have these stand abilities that were all showcased. This theory stemmed from two aspects. The fact that Dio was able to have a variation of Hermit Purple, and the second being that his Arcana was that of the world. The first is kind of self-explanatory, since stands are supposed to be unique manifestations of their user. Although this one is more often countered with the fact that Dio is using Jonathan's body, and that's his stand that Dio is using. Whether or not that's true, well, I don't really know or care. But let's take a different look at the world. In the major arcana, the world often refers to a reflection of the journey that a person takes. It would make sense if Dio had the abilities of the previous stand users, since before reaching the actual second half of the arc, the stands were based on the arcana of the tarot deck. Well, that was thrown out the window when the Egyptian stands were introduced. Still, here's where we can look towards the actual abilities of Dio's stand, the world. As anyone who knows anything about this show knows, the world's time stop ability is probably one of the more dangerous powers at this stage in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Yes, future characters in later parts do have much more powerful stance, as well as more creative abilities. Yes, Funny Valentine, your day will come someday. Maybe if this video gets 1 million views or something, I don't know. I highly doubt that'll happen. The world has another meaning in the Arcana, and one that I really feel reflects Dio as a character in Part 3, which is what this section will really focus on. While the world does signify completion while in the upright position, it can also signify when you are near completing your goals, which is what Dio is essentially at in his conquest. When the Joestar Egyptian group finally made their way to Dio's hiding place, he was all but fully recovered. He was so close to taking back the world at night. The only real obstacle was the Joestars that had searched through the sands of Egypt to stop him, and one that while he still had a bit of worry for, after all, he had learned about the tenacity of the Joestar bloodline against Jonathan. While Dio still possesses egotism, he also became a lot more careful in his approach for the Joestars. He didn't rush into battle all willy-nilly against Joseph, aware that the power of Haman could still affect him, and when Jotaro Kujo seemed to display his ability to move through Dio's frozen world, Dio did whatever he could to make sure that Jotaro was only playing a joke on the guy. And then when Jotaro actually enters his world, Dio becomes a lot more creative with his powers and abilities. Even when he believes that Jotaro is alive, even if there's just a fraction of a chance that Jotaro is, Dio keeps his distance from the downed Jojo, even listening to see if there was a heartbeat in the teen's body. This to me shows that Dio grew as a character when it came to his abilities in fighting, because while he does have a more overwhelming power that is growing every time he uses it, he cannot afford to underestimate his opponents, especially the little brat who apparently has the same power as him. Dio vs Jotaro is probably one of my more favorite fights in the animated series, as it really does ramp up the tension between the two, along with a crisp animation that spans over the course of several episodes. It does make the fight quite the nail-biter. And of course, Dio's demented tactics lead one to the most iconic moments in all of the series, and maybe in anime. There's just something cathartic about watching a teenager getting crushed by a road roller. And before you take that out of context, it's not like we had this moment.
Watch out!
Dio just made one major mistake.
You pissed me off.
I mean, anyone can piss off Jotaro easily, so can you really call that a mistake on Dio's part? And to top it off, Dio knows that he's the cream of the crop. He's the best of the best. He's got probably one of the most abusable stands in the series. On a side note, if you're wondering about the tanks on the world's back, apparently Araki designed that on purpose because he wanted Dio to be able to breathe during the stop time. Which makes some sense, I guess. And to make things more interesting, the world was the first stand that Araki actually designed, and was the beginning of the JoJo villain's trend of messing with the aspect of time. Sure, Dio is strong as a character, and can even play mind tricks with his stand the world, like how he did with Polnareff. But I think another aspect of Dio that makes him dangerous is his manipulative tendencies. And this is something that we talked about before. However, what we're looking at here is essentially a deal with the devil. Oftentimes, Dio is shown to be a master of manipulation with the stand users in the third part, whether it be through terror, using his flesh buds, or other ways. Dio was a threat. And even after his death, he was still a threat throughout the rest of the original universe's run. His ideology and plans lasting for far longer than even him. I'll talk about part 6 in a later segment of this video, but there's one more thing I want to bring up before we get to that part. This won't be a long chapter, but one that needs to be brought up. When it comes to villains, especially your main villain, they need to be a foil to the main character of your story. While foils aren't exclusive to villains, I feel like foils are the best way to think about your villains, since they're supposed to oppose the main character of your story, as well as act as a contrast to the characters in order to highlight their attributes. This is for both villains and heroes. Now, for say someone like Jonathan Joestar, that's actually quite easy. Mainly because Jonathan's about as entertaining as a piece of wood. Careful not to rub two sticks together near him or you might have a spark of personality there. I'm obviously joking when I say that, but there is quite a bit of contrast between the two characters, aside from the obvious other upbringings which I already covered. Characterization, Jonathan is often portrayed as a dorky nice guy, while Dio is an ambitious, evil street rat. Jojo wants to be a perfect gentleman, willing to risk himself for strangers. Dio loves to exploit people and kill dogs. And there goes my monetization. Thanks, YouTube! When it comes to the supernatural abilities they acquire, they're also opposing, with Haman and vampirism being the obvious there. Even their color choices are often in contrast to each other, especially after they get their powers, where Jonathan is often wearing blue while Dio wears red. I think it's also telling that when Jojo has defeated Dio, Dio grows to form a sort of respect to Jonathan, even to the point where Dio sees Jonathan being the only acceptable replacement for his new body. He even chastises his lackey who gives Jonathan disrespect. And funnily enough, one could even see that Dio understood that Jonathan's affection, even in the last moments as Jojo held Dio's head in his dying arms, that Jonathan was sincere. If it wasn't for Jonathan, Dio wouldn't have a new body to take into the new world. Dio saw Jonathan as the only person he's ever accepted as an equal, even when he was willing to kill Jonathan to save his own skin. Then if we were to compare him to the third Jojo we follow, Jotaro Kujo, there's even more of a contrast between the two. Even the structure of the story plays with this, since Jotaro was on the hunt for Dio to save his mother. Meanwhile, Dio is staying hidden within Cairo while his body adjusts and he practices with his stand. Other aspects to Dio being a foil with Jotaro, Dio tends to be over the top and present himself with enough charisma to make others loyal to his vampiric abs, but also willing to throw them away at a moment's notice. Jotaro starts off by telling his mother to "Shut up! Get out of my face, you bitch!" and is seen to be so stoic that often think that Jotaro is unable to show any actual emotions. However, that's a mask. Jotaro does care for others and has a good sense of justice and is surprisingly intelligent for a guy who looks like this. In that vein, Dio's really open with his personality, while Jotaro often hides his actual personality under his rough exterior. Heck, even their color codes are actually in distinction. Dio's primary colors in Part 3 are surprisingly bright yellow and gold, meanwhile Jotaro's got all his black coloring to him. I think because these two characters have such a contrast to each other that adds to the memorability of their battle in the streets of Cairo. When you see a clash of two completely different characters that have a lot of diametric elements, it becomes enthralling to watch them cross blows, play mind games with each other, and how the fight twists and turns. If you wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty of things though, Dio actively embraced the culture of Cairo and even says this line in the manga: "I outsmarted you. Don't you recognize this street I'm flying down? Or do all the streets look the same to a tourist?" That line implies that Dio probably is more familiar with the streets of Cairo, which makes the idea of him going out at night often. And we also see that Dio is capable of navigating the streets to find the knives and even the road roller. Cause yeah, when you think about it, Jotaro is a tourist, and Dio is an actual resident of Cairo. And going back to their outfits, Jotaro does wear his home country's culture literally on his sleeve, what with his uniform. Meanwhile, Dio's baggy pants and cropped jacket aren't exactly unheard of in several Middle Eastern cultures, including Egypt. Even the ring bracelets and curled shoes that Dio wears are also reminiscent of that culture. So one could say that Dio embraced the culture, while Jotaro didn't. Jotaro vs. Dio is probably one of the most iconic fights in the series, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of people who will say that there are a lot more fights that are memorable, and hey, that's fine. Not everyone can be right at all the time, especially when it comes to personal preferences. Still, I would argue that Dio is probably one of the most important characters within the original universe's timeline and has far-reaching implications for each part. Him being a foil to the characters just being part of that reason for that.
Get back, Jojo!
This is the part of the video where I talk about some of the less than specific aspects of Dio's character and actually reflects today's modern writing. Dio as a character throughout JoJo has a unique role, especially in the original universe part, that there's a shadow of Dio in the parts after 3. I stated earlier that Dio was probably one of Araki's favorite characters to draw, and I feel as though because of that, Dio's influence throughout the series has managed to ring true throughout the very least the original universe, at least to some degree. To make a long story short, let's consider the following. It was because of the bow and arrow that was used to give Dio his own stand powers that kicked off the events of Morio, especially in regards to Kira getting his own stand. His own flesh and blood, Giorno, became the main protagonist of Part 5, although his connection to Dio didn't really come up at all, but I digress. I mean, I would have killed to have Polnareff have a reaction to learning that Giorno was Dio's kid.
You what?
And in Part 6, Stone Ocean, Dio's teaching and relationship with Father Pucci, well, I'm sure you can guess from there, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Dio's shadow is cast over the entirety of the original universe's storyline, so when you have Jotaro saying that Dio is the Joestar family enemy, he isn't kidding. Even in death, Dio's influence and scorn still managed to resurface. And on a meta level, Dio started a lot of trends when it comes to JoJo villains, being over the top, having insane quirks, and having a time and space reality bending stand. Although if you really think about it, Dio's motivations are really basic and standard fare for villains. He wants to create an ideal world, one where he reigns supreme over everyone, basically taking over the world. Initially through his time-stopping ability and through his plans with Pucci to reset the world. I do think we need to talk about Pucci a little bit for this, since this does open up quite a bit of characterization for Dio, even if it's done retroactively and through flashbacks. Something that the heroes would never really know in the actual story. Because through the interactions with Pucci, we do see a different side of Dio, one that's more methodical and more inquisitive. This isn't trying to make Dio into less of a villain, but rarely do we get to see these kinds of moments where the main villains are just talking in normal conversation with another person. I think his conversations with Pucci, not only do we see some oddities with Dio's personality, like him building a model ship while talking to the young priest, and that can gleam a few interesting thoughts. Especially when we consider that he has the lifeboats out from the model and his ultimate hiding place was a desert. It's kind of funny when you think about it, especially when you consider that Dio spent about 100 years at the bottom of the ocean. It's elements like these that aren't explicitly told in the text, but are shown in the artwork and thinking back to the characters' events in their life that do flesh out the characters a bit more. These kinds of thoughts can elude the audience since it's more of a background storytelling and not shoved in your face, which is something you can really appreciate when you go back a few times to watch and read the material, and it really gets you thinking about the characters. If you recall when we talked about Dio's backstory about how he was abused as a child, watched his own mother dying before his very eyes by the bastard he had to call a father, and how time and classism of that period turned his father into a monster, Dio's ultimate goal, as revealed in Part 6, makes a lot of sense. His goal, revealed in conversations with Pucci, is to acquire heaven, or to acquire happiness. Dario's a bastard, no doubt about that. But I doubt the guy became a drunk abuser because he was satisfied with his life, and in turn, Dio became a monster as well because of this unhappiness, even going so far to kill his father, killing a dog, and killing his adopted father. Throughout Dio's life, he had been attempting to rectify the issues that plagued him. He's a street rat? Steal the riches! Been abused? Become essentially invincible. Be considered nothing more than dirt by other people? Lord over them as the absolute ruler of the world. And ultimately, as he says,
joy cannot be found by having an invincible body, vast riches, or even reigning over all humanity. In the end, the true winner is the one who gets to witness heaven.
As I've stated, you gotta remember this guy spent about 100 years with just himself and the corpse of Jonathan Joestar at the bottom of the sea, and he was an ever-living creature, left with only his thoughts and reflecting on the 20 years that he was actually alive before being confined to this very coffin at the bottom of the ocean. It's glossed over this fact, but I think it's an interesting thought process to consider Dio's position as a villain. And it makes more sense when you consider his plans to transform the world into Made in Heaven. Which, remember, Pucci's plan was Dio's plan, and the entire concept was to basically anticipate what the future would hold, that he would be the only man who constantly knows what was going to happen, what he was going to experience, and that he could be the only one to change it. It makes perfect sense considering that Dio's goals and ambitions were always snuffed out before they could really succeed, and who among us wouldn't want to change the past? And it was this plan that continued on within the man called Pucci. Dio's confidant, I think, would be a good word to use since Pucci was treated almost like an equal to him in their conversations, Dio even being pushed back a little by Pucci on things. And there was a lot of depth to Dio's character, and a lot of information that isn't explicitly stated in the series. Granted, a lot of people are more familiar with the memes associated with the character as well as his appearance and fight within Part 3, which is probably one of the more iconic parts of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. Dio's character is one of complexity when you look beyond the surface of his flashy appearance, and while he's totally written to be inexcusable, Araki has masterfully crafted a villain that has a lot more depth than what a lot of people would give credit towards. Dio is evil. Dio has reasons for being evil, but Dio doesn't apologize for his motives for the things that he does. Throw in the fact that Dio is probably one of the more visually appealing characters in JoJo, as well as how his visual presence works greatly with the series, it's no wonder why Dio's got a lot of love sent his way, even if he does some of the worst shit in the entire series. Hold up, do I really need to explain this one? I just gotten done telling you guys that there's a lot to Dio and why he's an amazing villain. His backstory is tragic, his abilities are dangerous, and he has more depth to him than the Ariana Trench. And even in death, he acts as the overarching villain for the entire first half of the series. It's clear that Dio was one of the most enticing antagonists ever made. He's a terrible threat to the protagonist, and he's teaming with not only stellar charisma, but he also represents the entirety of the franchise of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Everything that Dio does represents the over-the-top insanity that comes with the series. And he's a prominent figure of pop culture. Many people are aware of his iconic quotes before watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure because of the memes that spawned from this character. Dio, while a character who has depth to him, is also just an evil bastard who revels in every single evil action that he performed. And his evil haunted the Joestars even after his actual death. An evil like Dio never truly dies. And frankly, he's probably what a lot of villains should be nowadays. If you made it this part of the video, I appreciate you watching, and I think we should cap this off with seeing how many of you made it by typing in the comments, "Kono Dio da!" I appreciate your time, thank you for watching this essay, and it's because of viewers like you that I can make these kinds of videos, and I hope to keep making them. Thank you so much for all your time, patience, and everything that you have done for me. I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and don't forget to go...
Think of this as a gift, so I will allow you to know now. What you witnessed and felt was your future self laid bare. I obliterated time, then leapt beyond it. It doesn't matter who it is. I shall never allow any cretin to threaten my eternal transcendence. Not ever.
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is known for a lot of things. The over-the-top nature, the odd humor, or, in the case of this video, its villains. A lot of JoJo's rogues gallery are some of the more iconic villains in anime. Whether it be the vampire who's obsessed with the Jojo family, the serial killer who's obsessed with hands, or even the President of the United States of America. Never been proud to be an American. Yes, I will talk about the President one day. Your comments have not been ignored. But today we're talking about one of the more overlooked villains of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Diavolo of Part 5. And to be frank, it's kinda hard not to see why, especially considering that his motivation, even in the series he's in, is nothing more than a man in the shadows, looking to be the king of the world, while at the same time not being known. It's actually logical if you think about it. If you're a well-known figure of a crime organization that allows people to rise up in the ranks by killing others, you essentially paint a target on your back. Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Today we'll be diving deep into the man who burns his past away. I'm MangaKamen, and prepare yourselves.
Now may the fires of hell embrace you.
When you talk about Jojo villains, there's a lot you can glean from the characters, especially when we look at how Araki develops them. With Yoshikage Kira, he had elements of David Bowie for the design and elements of serial killers that Araki had researched. Dio was more or less inspired to be one of the worst villains of all time, not poorly written mind you, but to be an evil bastard that the audience would love to hate. But for Diavolo, well, as much as I couldn't find a lot of information on the development of Diavolo.
Ironic.
Maybe it's because I'm a lazy bastard and I couldn't find that little nugget of information about him, but the most I could find is this quote. It was shocking how, in the movie Total Recall, there was a guy with an extra face on his belly, with its own personality. For Diavolo, I thought he would look punk if his hair had a leopard pattern.
That can't be it. Where's the rest of it?
I like Total Recall as much as the next guy, but in all honesty, I really can't stretch that out for a good 5 minutes with this segment, so we'll do the next best thing. We'll establish who Diavolo is. Diavolo is the main antagonist of Jojo Part 5, the boss of the Passion, the mafia that has its hands in several different kinds of crimes across Italy. He's also the founder of this organization, and it's an organization that specializes in secrecy, since if they were out in the open, that would make them targets of assassination and law enforcement. Considering that Diavolo is a man who values his privacy to an extreme manner, even to the point that he uses an actual alternate personality that causes physical changes, this works. It's actually an interesting thought process, since if you consider the nature of crimes and by extent the mafia, working in the shadows and hiding your own power from prying eyes of authority makes sense with Diavolo's paranoia. Throw in the fact that the Passione has several stand users, of which their abilities cannot be seen by regular people, you can easily have your crimes be committed with your stand and most people wouldn't be none the wiser. I mean, even if a guy did explode outwards with a car. Our protagonist, Giorno Giovanna, does that in the opening of Part 5. So there is potential, and if we look towards the villains previously in Jojo, Diavolo actually continues a trend. If you really consider the actions and conditions for each of the villains of previous parts, they had a reason or another to hide at one point. Dio in Part 1 had to hide his true motivations while he was human for years, and when he became a vampire and was defeated by Jonathan, he had to hide in order to recover. The Pillarmen, while I wouldn't say are cowardly, they had the same aversion to sunlight. In Dio Part 3, he had to recover and get used to his new body, all the while keeping himself hidden from the Joestars while he trained for, using the world. In Kira in Part 4, well, I don't think I have to say anything about this guy, if you know anything about him. What I'm trying to get at is that a lot of the villains in Jojo, even in future parts, will often hide themselves to some degree or another. While stand users will inevitably come crossing each other's paths, that doesn't stop the villains from hiding themselves from the heroes or enemy stand users. Diavolo is probably one of the more extreme ones, well, save for maybe...
I don't get it.
But that's probably for another video at another time. We're talking about the man who was willing to go so far to protect his identity that he was willing to kill his only daughter so people couldn't trace him from her. Man, this should have been the video with the surf shark ad so I can make a joke about not having to pay such a heavy price so you could hide your identity. God, I'm such an idiot. Regardless of your narrator's intelligence level, I will fully admit that Diavolo is not exactly the most discussed of villains, mainly due to the fact that his character is to be a mystery. That's the point, of a man whose goal is to not exist in the mind of others, but controlling the world of crime from the shadows. In a sense, Diavolo's motivation is actually similar to that of Kira's, to indulge in his vice and not have a worry in the world because of it. It's a shame since the aspect of mystery of Diavolo is extremely dangerous. In comparison to Dio and Kira, with Dio, we and the heroes know exactly who Dio is. But the true measure of his abilities were what made the Joestar Egyptian tour group wary of Dio and try to hurry up to kill him when they were in his lair. In contrast with Kira, while we the audience know his abilities and when he adopts a new identity we are aware of what he looks like, the Morio group doesn't know this. Diavolo is actually a combination of both those mysterious elements, where we as the audience and the characters don't know what he looks like or what his abilities are, at least not until it's too late. Even after we see his abilities, we still don't know exactly who Diavolo is. Although the doppio scenes do kind of give away that something isn't quite right. God, what a freak. Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about doppio in this too. I mean, the two are essentially two sides of the same coin. However, we as the audience do get to learn more about the character, about how his birth was nearly impossible, about how he was born in an all-female prison with no father of a 2-year pregnancy. Not that it really matters in the grand scheme of things in the overall plot of Jojo. When he was 19, he had faked his own death, all the while killing a few other people in the process. What'd he do after that? Well, he decided to go to Egypt, for some reason, to join an excavation. Well, he was the one who did find the arrowheads that allow people to gain the power of stands, selling most of them, save for one, for great money, and then formed the Passion when he returned to Italy. It's not really a lot to be learned about Diavolo, at least with the official material. There's a lot of fan theories, but as we stated on this channel multiple times, theories are just theories. Nothing more, nothing less. But for now, we'll be referring to what makes Diavolo to be a threat.
Think for a moment. Is anyone worthier? Can you name even one person? You know that I alone am worthy of becoming king!
One of the key elements that I've said in all my videos is that to have an effective villain, you need to be able to have them be a threat, especially if they're intended to be that way. If they're not threatening, what's the point? If the heroes aren't going to take the villains seriously, why should the audience? This ties into the point I made in the last segment, that Diavolo has a unique situation in Jojo, and it's one of his greatest strengths, that if you don't know who he is, you'll never be able to defeat him because of his stand's ability. Which, hey, since I brought it up, we might as well talk about his stand's abilities before we get to his proper introduction. Diavolo's stand, King Crimson, has two prominent abilities, the ability to erase time for up to 10 seconds, and his ability to see in the future, although that second one is due to his sub-stand called Epitaph. Two stand abilities work in tandem with each other. Epitaph forecasts the future, projected in Diavolo's hair. Whatever his stand projects is 100% fated to happen, and this is where his main stand ability comes into play, King Crimson. That allows him to skip time up to 10 seconds. When activated, all will move along the predestined paths that were projected by Epitaph. Everyone but Diavolo himself. Everyone affected will have no control on what they will do during the time skip, and will have no memory of what happened. Diavolo, on the other hand, is free to move wherever he wants. In return, he cannot interact with anything. He essentially phases through it, and anything he interacts with will ignore him. He's immune from physical attacks and cannot attack anyone during the time skip. In that case, he basically just repositions himself for strategic purposes. The best example would be when he's fighting Bucciarati, since he was able to keep himself hidden from view with only his stand actually being fully visible to the character and the audience at the time. And this power actually works extremely well with a character like Diavolo. Diavolo's nature is that of a paranoid person, and one of the aspects of paranoia is the anticipatory fear of the unknown. So with the power of Epitaph, Diavolo can plan ahead and change his strategies. Considering some of his personality traits, this is especially fitting, so he wouldn't have to worry about what'll happen to him. Without this power, Diavolo would be a lot easier to catch off guard, since he does seem to be pretty reliant on its powers to predict his opponent's moves. It can also be symbolic of the fact that Diavolo was actually pretty short-sighted, despite his long-term plans. There's also the fact that these two abilities can be used in collaboration. Epitaph on its own predicts the future, and what happens in that 10 seconds of time is set in stone. But when used with time skip, Diavolo can avoid the prediction's outcome entirely. Diavolo claims that this is all due to fate. For the 10-second time skipped, everyone but him follows their fates to the letter. To point out, there were some discrepancies with how King Crimson actually worked due to how the manga had portrayed it, but the anime has managed to clear up a few misconceptions. At least that's how I figured in my research. But when you couple this with his personality and secretive nature, it's a deadly combination that works well to his advantage. When you look towards some of the previous villains with their stands and consider their powers, they match pretty well with the villains' personalities. Dio viewed himself to be above all mankind, and he wasn't wrong, and a power that effectively could shut down other stands and anything else fits with a man who sees himself as the greatest living organism in the world. Kira, on the other hand, was a man who wanted to live a quiet life while indulging in his personal vices. As such, Killer Queen had the ability to create bombs in secret as well as remove any sort of trace of who Kira really was. Diavolo is in the same vein with his powers, which not only allow him to see into the future, but also properly plan for it, so he could effectively keep his identity secret. To be fair, Diavolo is quite the coward. He believes that the past, no matter how insignificant it may seem, can be used against someone. As such, he does everything he can to protect his identity and preserve his anonymity, including trying to kill his own child. It's because of this cowardice and paranoia that spurs Diavolo into becoming frantic. It's almost like a cornered animal, and because of that desperation, they will lash out worse than you would think. It's why when the Hitman team, when they asked for territory and a raise, Diavolo turned them down. They began to search for his information. One of their members, Sorbet, was sliced up alive and the other, Gelato, committed suicide. By sending this message, Sorbet's body was frozen in formaldehyde and framed, sent to the Hitman team. Truly a gruesome message. It should be noted that Diavolo actually managed to get quite a few kills due to his short-sighted tactics, however. He managed to kill Bucciarati, Abbacchio, and Narancia. In addition to Polnareff, if you want to throw in Doppio, he defeated Rosetto. Technically. There's a lot to be said about Diavolo's abilities, but then there's also Doppio, a second skin as it were, which is a fictional version of DID, dissociative identity disorder, or as some people like to view it a long time ago, multiple personalities. I need to make it clear that it's a fictional version of this, since I'm pretty sure DID doesn't change a person's height and body type. Now, I'm not here to talk about if it's a proper representation of the disorder. I'm pretty sure that the source that Araki used for the story was outdated anyway, so you can't really look for much realism, especially with the inclusion of the physical changes when alters change. I'm pretty sure this isn't a symptom of a disorder. I just want to make it clear I'm not a psychologist, nor is this the point of the video, so please don't get in my case for that. Instead, the fact is that he has an alternate personality to use to his advantage. Since Doppio tends to be a really loyal person to Diavolo, the mob boss can use another skin to walk around in the day. Hell, the fact that Doppio seems to be more innocent as a character also plays into that, since people often view that as someone who couldn't possibly be related to the boss. And yet, Abbacchio faced that same challenge. So there's a lot of potential for Diavolo to be a villain and utilize his abilities to do so. However, like a lot of villains, he has his own weaknesses. And that comes from his...
What are all these dragons made of metal?
There is a recurring element in Jojo, and that is fate. There are many characters in the series of Jojo that will often reference fate, such as no matter how strong or weak, all Stan users are destined to meet one another. That's a fact. Diavolo is no different. It's an obsession of his, where he believes that it guides his life and that fate can control the action of all things, and that he is the one who can control that. Consider, if you will, that there are fortune tellers within the story of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, and oftentimes they are considered to be a lot more credible in the world of Jojo. And as we've stated in the last part, one of Diavolo's powers is that he can see about 10 seconds into the future. And there are multiple times where Diavolo will say that it's his fate, or that he's assured of his victory.
But it's not defeat! It may not be now, but victory will be mine! I'm coming to crush your skull properly this time, as fate ordained! The future can only hold one of us, and it has chosen me!
But considering my last line in the previous section, this raises a question. This is a weakness? Well, yeah. Every one of the villains in Jojo has a weakness, and oftentimes it has to do with their own personality quirks, and it comes from egotism as well. Dio and Cars believed that they were the greatest creatures in the world. Kira shouted his name out when he believed that he had conquered his enemies, and later on Pucci would believe that his ability to predict all actions that would happen led him to his death at the hands of a Stan that had almost once defeated him before. Diavolo is no different, as his arrogance and belief in his ability to accept what fate sets before him unironically caused him to make some very serious mistakes. Let's take, for example, the arrows. One could argue that it was fate that guided Diavolo to find the arrows that he sold all but one, and then he gave that one to one of his lackeys to create new stand use. Why is this an issue? It plays into Diavolo's short-sightedness. Without thinking on testing them beyond getting a stand and recruits, because of this, later on, this decision would create a stand that would defeat him. And his attempts to go back on that decision in the last part of the fight would lead to his final defeat. He already had the arrow in his hands many years ago, but due to him wanting to get results immediately, it cost him the possibility to get a greater power. The Hitman team merely asked for a raise and some territory, something that pretty much every other team in the Passion had, and Diavolo said no. And while killing Sorbet and Gelato sent a clear message to not search for his identity, simply trying to work with a very competent, effective, and dangerous assassin team would have been a much better compromise and would have netted him a stronger and more loyal team. Instead of waiting for Trish to be delivered to him, as was the plan, and when Bucciarati's gone, Diavolo could kill Trish on his own time. The mob boss just decides to snatch her away from Bucciarati at the last second. Sure, Diavolo does have the power to kill Bucciarati, and does so. It saved him a headache, however, especially when he's well aware of Bucciarati's nature and skill as a stand user, as well as pretty much everyone else who's outside the building.
I gloved up.
There are a number of other things that we have to consider with this, but these are some of the bigger issues of Diavolo's short-sightedness, and it goes into play with his fatal character flaw, how he's willing to get short-term success without considering the long-term ramifications of his decision. Now, am I saying this makes him a bad villain? No. No, I am not. Just because a villain makes mistakes like these, that doesn't mean that they're a bad character. The fact that a lot of these issues stem from Diavolo's paranoia add to his humanization. While his motivations for starting the Passion are exactly clear, we do need to consider that before he went to Egypt, he did effectively destroy his identity and lit a town on fire because of it. So ever since then, the shadow of paranoia of someone possibly discovering him and his crimes could be considered to be clawing at his back. That's understandable when you consider that Diavolo didn't just go for the short-term wins, and had thought out his situations more, he'd probably be a lot more successful as a villain. Then again, if we looked at any of the villains and point out their flaws in hindsight, and as an outside third party who isn't actually part of the story, anyone can make these observations. Hell, one could easily argue that there was a great risk to testing the arrow on a stand, since not every person who gets stabbed with the arrow becomes a stand user. Some of them die, or it wouldn't even be possible to do so considering that stands aren't exactly made of physical material. The reason I'm bringing these up is to talk about the character flaw, his paranoia, his short-sighted decisions, and his obsession with fate do blind him to the issues that his plans would spawn. It's a mixture of personal issues which can cause Diavolo to perform some seriously terrible acts and at the same time open up to a lot more issues and problems in the future. And I honestly think that's pretty good. I think it's humanizing that he makes mistakes like this. It doesn't mean he's a bad villain, it just means that he's a very troubled person.
Oh, I get it! I get jokes.
When I make my videos talking about villains, one of my favorite parts is when I make a comparison to the protagonists of their series, and if they act as a good foil. Because when you look towards a hero, you need to look towards their villain or antagonist as well, since the point of a hero is to have them challenged in the story, not just physically, not just through combat, but also through characterization. We love to watch heroes overcome the challenges thrown towards them, and villains are a great way of doing that. Jojo is a bit of a different beast when it comes to the style of hero's journey, especially when it comes to its protagonists. A good portion of the time, while the heroes are challenged in fights and such, there isn't really great development cycle for the characters to grow, at least a good portion of the time. I do not want to come off as if I'm generalizing the entire work in that regard, because there's a lot of development for many characters, but in part 5, part of the reason why Giorno to shine as a protagonist is because he's so gung-ho about his goal about becoming a gangstar. If you're not familiar with Giorno's backstory, the kid didn't really have a happy childhood. He was neglected by his mother, abused by his second father, was bullied relentlessly for being a foreigner, oh, and was the son of Dio. I know that sounds like an afterthought, especially considering that Dio was one of the most iconic villains in JoJo, but that's because it was an afterthought, and never really ties into the actual plot or story of Part 5. That's for a different video down the line though. I mean, if you want that video, please consider typing in the comments, Golden Wind! And give this video a like. Once you do, we'll make a video talking about everyone's golden boy, Giorno Giovanna, when we hit 10k likes. Shilling aside, the point I'm trying to get at was that Giorno had a very rough childhood, and it wasn't until he actually found his dream after helping a gangster escape from death that things managed to turn around for him, and it was his inspiration to go out and seek his dream. If you think about it, Giorno is willing to do whatever he can to fulfill his dream, even putting himself in the line of fire. You know, standard fare for a heroic character. Meanwhile, in comparison to that of Diavolo, a character who did actually grow up in a rather privileged location, Diavolo is a coward. Giorno throughout the series is willing to take risks and gambles, relying on his teammates numerous times to get the job done if he can't do it. Diavolo, on the other hand, is willing to use anyone and everyone as a tool, prepared to destroy them if they fail him or go against him. In addition, while he's not afraid to sully his own hands with these deeds, he does so more in the shadows, only forced out into the open when he has no other choice in the matter. One could even argue that Diavolo is a foil to the rest of the main cast of Part 5, as each of them had their own terrible pasts but managed to get ahead of it because they worked together. This then ties into another aspect that goes well with the characters in Diavolo, a good foil to each other. And that, my friends, is trust. Diavolo is a paranoid megalomaniac who only cares about himself, with his fascination over fate honestly causing him to make mistakes or to outright deny the fate that he fails to see. Then you look over at Team Bucciarati, a team that is filled with misfits, each of them with their own terrible fates that were shackled onto them. But the team has a great level of trust between them all, with trust being a very necessary aspect, especially in the world of the Mafia. If you read or watch Team Bucciarati, it's pretty evident that trust is a major component on how they work.
Tabacchio!
I hope for all our sakes, you're not letting a hang-up get in the way of survival.
I can't reveal my stand to just anyone, especially a complete stranger who has zero loyalty to me.
And one of the key traits to Giorno's story is to gain the trust of the crew.
Come what may, I refuse to give up my dream.
What the hell does that mean?
Go on! Solve it then! Don't let me down!
Whereas Diavolo has no trust in those around him, Giorno opens himself up to the group, even going so far as to risk his life so he can gain the trust of them. Also drinking piss, but that's neither here or there. Sure, he's doing it for the sake of his dream, but as the story goes on, we see that Giorno generally does care for the Bucciarati group.
That's now in your skull! I win!
What? Mista. Your determination. It shines even brighter than the morning sun, and it's put us on the path toward tomorrow. We've won because of you.
What the hell?
It's a genuine bond, and that's something that Diavolo refuses himself to have. Even with his right hand and alternate persona, Doppio gets tossed away to die, leaving Diavolo all alone to try to acquire the arrow. And it really was a combination of the remainder of Team Bucciarati that managed to get the arrow to Giorno and allowing him to evolve his stand into Requiem. I like to think that this is an interesting way to consider the dynamic between Giorno and Diavolo, especially since they don't really get a lot of characterization with each other. Which is probably the best way you can do this sort of thing, considering that Diavolo's goal is to remain hidden, and as well matches paranoia. For those who don't know about paranoia, one of the more common definitions is as such, suspicion or distrust of others. And as you can imagine, it makes it very hard to have confidence with other people, so Diavolo built up walls around him so he could protect himself. All the while, Giorno lowered whatever walls he had in order to earn the trust of Team Bucciarati. And in turn, he could trust them, much like how he puts his faith into Bucciarati himself. There are other parallels that one could make, such as how we're shown that while Giorno is quite strong, he's pretty much quiet as a protagonist. In fact, that's probably one of the major issues that a lot of people have with Giorno, that he's kind of bland. He doesn't really boast all that much, and in comparison, Diavolo has such a twisted ego that he actually believes that fate is on his side, even to the point where he feels like he's entitled to the power, making plenty of speeches about it. It's his destiny! Or look towards their stand abilities. Much like how Josuke and Kira's powers were opposing, one could view the same between Giorno and Diavolo. Giorno's gold experience has a similar healing utility of that of Josuke's crazy diamond. However, not only does it allow Giorno to use it on himself, but he can also technically bring back the dead, albeit temporarily. One could even consider that going against fate, again, temporarily. Gold Experience's main ability is to give life, and that could be seen as a selfless act, incorporated into a stand. Meanwhile, King Crimson has a similar effect that allows him to bypass fate, or in Diavolo's mind, control it. Ultimately, it's a selfish power, as the world itself practically freezes and Diavolo can position himself however he wants in those precious few seconds. It's even funnier when you realize that Time Erasure cannot directly control the world while he erases the time. He can only position himself, meaning it's only focused on him. A completely selfish power. You could obviously say I'm stretching with these, but I don't know, I think these are rather fun ideas to consider when you're looking at a villain and a hero and how they can contrast with each other, even down to their abilities, design, and concepts.
Think fast, Chuckle Nuts!
Diavolo was a contentious villain, and it's mostly due to his mysterious nature. On one hand, the concept of a villain so powerful that he hides his presence from everyone and he could potentially be the person next to you is an element that even the part played with.
Rice Pirate!
But by that same token, a lot of people see Diavolo as a villain with less personality, not helped by the fact that we don't really get a lot of insight on how he is the way he is. Even more so, as the split personality element between him and Doppio isn't exactly expanded upon, and is more or less left up to mystery as well. That isn't a bad thing per se, since not every villain needs to have a backstory that is so tightly woven that there's no actual debate to be had about the character. Frankly speaking, while looking for research for this video, there were a lot of things that did open my eyes to not only Diavolo as a villain, but Part 5 as a whole. Diavolo, the devil, his stand is terrifying and his behavior is unpredictable, and when rewatching and rereading, it makes you really consider how that made him a very scary villain and to think about. I love how his two stands are references to the band King Crimson and the song of their first album, Epitaph. And if you want to go even further than that, you can talk about how Diavolo himself is a 21st century schizoid man, which is the first track on that same album. Oh, Rocky, your musical references never cease to amaze me. There is a lot to talk about with the villains of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I'm glad people are at the very least enjoying the videos that I talk about them. So, I guess the only thing I can say now is, I'm MangaKamen. Thanks for watching, and arrivederci!
Joestar bloodline has to be expected. They drew strength from their pride and courage, and came together to conquer their fate. However, that connection through blood is also their weakness. I must eliminate any obstacles in the way of my destiny. I feel no remorse for them or you, nor will I let you go free. I'll put an end to everything.
It's been quite a while since we talked about the JoJo villains, so I think it's time we visit the topic once again. And a while ago I asked my followers on the community channel tab if we should talk about the Pillar Men, and of course...
2, 3, 5. I must stay calm. 7. Count prime numbers to compose my thoughts.
And while people did vote for Pucci to be the clear winner in this one, I will say that I kinda want to save the Pillar Men for last. At least in the animated JoJo videos for my villain analysis. Because there's a lot to say about the characters because, well, there's 3 of them. That isn't to say Pucci himself is no slouch. I do believe Pucci as a villain works wonderfully, especially when you think about it. Pucci is probably one of the more successful villains that we've talked about on the channel whenever we discuss JoJo villains. But enough of my rambling. Hi, I'm MangaKamen, and this, my friends, is Pucci, JoJo's villain of succession. Warning, spoilers for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and content warning for when we discuss his background.
Who is that?
I know that guy. He serves as a priest at the prison's chapel. What is he doing here?
Pucci is the main antagonist of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6, Stone Ocean, and frankly speaking, while I wouldn't consider myself to be a part of the JoJo community, looking into discussions about the character, I often find him to be overlooked at times. Of course, some of the more interesting commentary about Pucci is that he's a Dio simp.
Looking at porn is sin?
Yes, unless you're looking at porn of Dio.
I honestly don't see a lot of unwarranted hatred towards the character, even as a villain, but in comparison to other villains in JoJo like Dio, or Kira, or even the President of the United States, no, not that one, the actual good one. God bless America! Pucci doesn't really stand out much. And I could be completely off base. Again, I don't have my finger on the pulse of the JoJo community. I prefer to have a wide variety of content on the channel to express all my interests, so for all I know, people could consider him to be the best JoJo villain of all time. I learned this when I put my video out on Diavolo, and people thought he wasn't divisive. Pucci as a character has an interesting background, especially considering the location of Part 6's story takes place in America at the time. We have the tragedy of his sister, weather report, and his connections to Dio that I will dive into a bit more real soon. When being developed, Araki toyed with the concept of Pucci being a priest as just a ruse, not really focusing on the religious elements of his character. And that not only did Araki want to make Father Pucci into a teacher of sorts, trying to make it not so obvious that Pucci was the main bad guy. While I can commend those efforts, this is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's not that hard to spot the antagonist sometimes. Anyone who dresses in outrageous clothing is usually said to be part of the actual story to some capacity, most of the time. Which, hey, I'm not knocking. Pucci's design of a priest and odd hair patterns does allow him to stand out from the rest of the villains in JoJo. There's also the fact that the man's stands also have uniqueness to them. Whitesnake being his default with the main ability to remove other stands and memories in the form of discs, although the discs can have other things in it like aspects like eyesight or boiling water. Then there's Seamoon, the stand that he developed with Dio's instructions, which has the ability to manipulate gravity, and finally Made in Heaven, which possesses the ability of time acceleration and allows Pucci to basically reset the entire universe at his will. Pucci is also probably one of the more active villains in the JoJo's rogue gallery, constantly putting himself into the mix, and while he does have his own goons and mooks that work for him in a sense, I do appreciate when villains do participate in the plot rather than being a shadowy figure hidden in the background, most of the time. If you really want to get into it, Pucci had at least 8 encounters with the main group, with half of them including the main character Jolene. I should note that he typically does allow his initial stand, Whitesnake, to take the reins of this, so he can maintain his own level of secrecy in the plot, which to me makes sense. He's also one of the more precautious of the villains in Jojo, even in comparison to Kira. Hell, even when Pucci required his ultimate stand made in heaven, he still took precautions against the Jojo group. But what I think makes Pucci to be a fascinating villain is his motivations aren't really as selfish as other villains, at least in Jojo. Kira wanted a quiet life while killing innocent girls. Diavolo was being a mob boss who wanted power and was willing to hurt anyone to maintain that veil of power, and Dio, well...
You there, woman. How about you make yourself useful and fetch me my leg?
Listen, I just want an excuse to play that clip because it's funny, but Dio was a pretty selfish person, especially in the earlier parts. This shouldn't be up for discussion. But Pucci? Maybe this is me misreading the character, but he truly believed that what he was doing was for the greater good. For those who aren't familiar with Pucci's ultimate goal, his idea was to use Made in Heaven to allow humans to know their fated paths, and allow them resolution to accept destiny. Pucci was trying to create heaven through time acceleration. Anyone who is alive during the acceleration will have their souls experiencing their past lives. They will have complete knowledge of them, and including their entire future. And through that, according to Pucci's beliefs, humans will no longer live the dreadful uncertainty of their future. They will know everything that will happen in their lives, and in theory, live peacefully and in bliss where they don't have to worry about their fate. Now, I personally think that's kind of BS, mainly because of my own belief system and opinions on fate. But we're not talking about me. We're never talking about me on this channel. What we're talking about is that the man managed to convince himself what he was doing was for the good of all people. We can argue the morality and possibility that fate is set in stone all we want, but I do appreciate that this nuance with the character, and how there's a bit of an irony with the whole priest doing terrible things to save people.
Hooray! It's the Catholic Church! We have come to save you from yourselves! Oh no, it's the Catholic Church!
Kind of like the inverse of the path to hell is paved with good intentions. There's also the fact that Pucci does have his out there moments that can be, well, comical in a dark humor sort of way, like him playing Hallelujah with some random guy, literally using him to play Hallelujah. But what really works with Pucci is his interesting backstory and how it ties into his motivations.
You look familiar, boy. Ain't you the rich kid who goes to a seminary? Are you sure you want to be doing this?
If everything goes well, I will double your pay.
Pucci's backstory and motivations are tied pretty close together, even going to his birth, where his brother Domenico, aka Weather Report, was replaced with a stillbirth by a mother who wanted to raise a child of her own. It's not too widely expanded upon from there, but does play a real key part in the tragedy that is Pucci. Then we go 15 years into the future, when Pucci has his first encounter with Dio, who not only would change the destiny of Pucci, but would also fix his foot and give him a stand arrow before fading away into the darkness. It then cuts to a fateful encounter where Pucci hears the confession of the mother that stole his brother, and he learns that his brother isn't actually dead, and it's a secret that Pucci has kept to himself. It's understandable. For over a decade and a half, the young man had thought that his brother was dead, and if he were to reveal the situation, he would be excommunicated from the church, since you're not allowed to reveal that sort of information when you get it from a confession. It's called the sacramental seal, and a priest can't break the seal to save his own life, to protect his good name, to refute a false accusation, to save another life, or to aid in the course of justice, or to avert a public calamity. Whether or not you agree with this, it's a tradition in the church, and considering that Pucci wanted to become a priest, doing this would kill any hope he could have in becoming one. And then comes the fact that his younger sister started dating Domenico, who was named West Blue Marine, but for the sake of this video, I'll just refer to him as Weather. So we've got a pretty big internal conflict with Pucci. Obviously, he wants to prevent his sister and once thought to be dead brother from becoming an item and more, and if I had to explain why you don't want that to happen, then humanity is truly lost. However, he tried to expose this fact directly, the question of how he learned of this information would come up, and would eventually lead to Pucci learning it through the confessional. Breaking the sacred confession and would prevent him from acquiring his dream to becoming a priest. Throw in the fact that he's a young, inexperienced man, Pucci is trapped in a catch-22. So in order to avoid hurting his sister not being excommunicated, Pucci decides to work with a shady man to break the two up. Unfortunately, Pucci hired a man who was racist, and when looking into Weather's past, he learned that his parents were an interracial couple. I'm talking about the mother that stole him as a kid. She married a black man, and Anyway, after calling the terrible people in white robes, the shady man and his cohorts murdered Weather due to their hatred. Look, I want to be more direct here, but YouTube is a bitch, and since I need money to eat, I'm trying my best not to get caught by YouTube's AI. Weather did survive the onslaught, but under the impression that Weather was dead, Poochie's sister Perla took her own life. And when Poochie learned of his sister's death, he was pierced with the arrow, awakening his stand of White Snake, which also activated Weather's stand, which unironically saved Weather from taking his own life after he learned that Perla died. Eventually, Weather would confront Poochie in a suicidal murderous rampage, and Poochie would take away Weather's memories to stop him. Now, I've already discussed Poochie's plans in the previous section where he wanted humans to learn their fates. And with this backstory, it would make a lot of sense why he wanted to do this. If humans were able to perceive their own future, his sister Perla wouldn't have gone into a relationship with Weather, and in turn, Poochie wouldn't have been put into a situation where he would be forced to choose between his family and his fate. Heck, it could have even prevented his brother from being taken away at birth. Poochie is a tragic character, and that tragedy does translate well into his motivations, and can be even understandable why he would go to the lengths he did in order to prevent these events that caused him such pain. This is a pretty uncomfortable backstory for a villain, but sometimes stories do have to have uncomfortable elements in them, and that's alright. These kinds of events should be viewed and shown how they can have an effect on people. At his lowest point though, Poochie's mind turned to his encounter with Dio, a strange man who claimed to have an allergy to sunlight, somehow healed his crooked foot, and gave him an item that would allow Poochie to save the memories of his sister before she died. Fate had essentially ruined Poochie's happiness, and the level of coincidence that fell into place so well that even I would imagine that fate dealt a hand worse to someone. Poochie believes in destiny, and as such, it's not too far-fetched for a man like him to believe that if we knew the future, even subconsciously, that true happiness could be achieved. And it makes sense when Poochie helps Dio form his plan for heaven, which really does the one thing that Poochie would want to happen for happiness for the entire human race. It just falls into place. And it's here I need to ask a question. Would you consider this to be a good thing? After all, when you boil it down, Poochie really doesn't want anyone to suffer in the same way he and his family did. We can argue about doing this for the greater good of people, or even forcing this onto people against their wills. But as the intentions are, they're at least noble, right? Making the heaven where people know their fates to not suffer is a good goal in a sense. However, the issue comes from the roots of the plan, i.e., Dio. The moment that Poochie met Dio, one of the most evil people in the world of Jojo, the noble intentions of Poochie began to become corrupted, and Poochie is willing to murder for Dio's cause. This would lead Poochie to manipulating many people, killing several in the process, and attempting to kill anyone who dared to get his way into heaven. And that to me is also a tragedy. Poochie, while he certainly isn't a good person, did genuinely believe that what he was doing was for the betterment of mankind, except he became corrupted by the suave tongue of a golden-haired vampire. And that, I think, is great tragedy, especially for a manga and anime. So we've established his motives and backstory, which can lay a great foundation for a villain, but what about the execution of Poochie? I will say that before Poochie is formally introduced in the show, we do learn of him through his use of White Snake, and how he keeps a good distance away from danger. I honestly do enjoy that how he can be so close to the action, but at the same time keeps his distance and maintain his identity secret from the main cast for so long. Hell, he's arguably one of the most successful Jojo villains. He was able to defeat Jotaro Kujo, stealing his stand of memories, using said memories in order to evolve his stand by fusing with a green baby, and Poochie as a villain does what I think good villains should do. Actually think, react, and evolve accordingly against his opposition. Probably one of the best moments of this would be when Weather Report was using his stand to create rainbows that turned people into snails. I realize that for the people who are watching this and are familiar with Part 6 are probably going, what the fuck? And then I say, it's Jojo, just roll with the weirdness and you'll be fine.
Weird.
Anyway, Poochie, having already seen this ability years ago and having learned that eyesight was the key to this power, actually uses his ability to remove his eyesight input into discs.
Oh, well, that's convenient.
It shows a concerted effort for him to actually take into account any sort of snags in the road for his plans. Hell, when Poochie was leaving the prison to actually finish his plan for heaven, he took precautions to prevent Jolene from leaving with Jailhouse Rock, and still had other stand users work under him in order to prevent the pursuers from reaching him, at least until he had Made in Heaven.
I've come for you.
Let's look towards other villains from Jojo that I covered in this series. While I wouldn't say Dio is totally lacking in this department, he was more or less kept in the shadows in Stardust Crusaders in order for his body to heal, sending goon after goon to kill the Joestar Egyptian tour. Some had unique plans and all, but really Dio was hands off for most of the adventure and with his followers. Kira really didn't do too much to keep himself hidden or throw others off his tracks. Most of the work was done by a ghost of his father who created stand users who would sometimes throw a wrench into the efforts to stop the crew from finding Kira. Then again, it was kind of pure luck that Superfly worked at all, since its stand is pretty much just to capture its own user and he couldn't even leave the tower himself.
He botched it!
As for Diavolo, while he did have a lot of caution to keep himself hidden, even going so far as to have a second personality that changed his appearance, he made a lot of mistakes. One of the biggest would be treating his assassination team like crap, killing 2 of them, and making the rest of them out to be enemies. If it wasn't for them trying to figure out who he was via his daughter, things probably could have gone a lot different for Diavolo. Pucci, on the other hand, seemed to have a bit of a blend here of all 3. He has the ability to bestow stands onto other people, and even if they're stands, they can actively kill the user in the process, like Highway to Hell. Ultimately, it works out for him as a distraction even if the user fails. It can be argued that while there's a ton of luck in Pucci's travels, such as when he just so happened to meet 3 of Dio's illegitimate children, that's more attributed to fate than anything else, something that the series has established to be the case in the past. My point is that Pucci does tend to be a lot more careful with his plans, and he's not afraid of throwing away his pawns when he's done with them and evolving his plans in turn. It's something that effective villains will do, and while it does have its issues since eventually you'll be left alone with no allies, once Pucci acquired Made in Heaven, he doesn't really need any other help. He was able to kill not only Jotaro Kujo, but pretty much everyone who was after him in the Joestar group. And the only reason why he lost and was killed was because of something he didn't take into account, that his brother's stand weather report would be injected into Emporio and how unpredictable the stand was. And I ain't gonna lie, it's really extremely satisfying to see Pucci defeated. Listen, I don't care what anyone says. The moment that Stardust Crusaders theme starts playing when Pucci is about to be killed off and then punched into the ground just lights up the neurons in my brain. It's just a good song that hearing it as a combat theme or one of triumph just really puts a cap into the finale of a relatively successful villain. I mean, it was played when Dio was killed and had his head explode, so why not here? And I know there's a bit of a discussion about how Pucci being defeated by Emporio and how it feels somewhat cheap that Pucci wasn't defeated by the main protagonist of the part. And trust me, I feel your pain in that regard, even more so when you consider that it was an 11-year-old child that defeated the main villain at the end. But as Emporio himself says,
I'm not the one in control here. This is weather forecast.
He's not the one in control. Rather, it's Weather Report, the stand of Pucci's brother doing his own thing. And as Emporio says as well,
You're the one who stole Weather's memory, and the one who awakened him again when he regained his power to project killer snails.
this was all done by Pucci's hands. Had he not killed Weather Report well before the others, the group wouldn't have been able to get Weather's disc, and Emporio wouldn't have had the disc on him. Regardless, to me, it's not so much Emporio was the one who defeated Pucci, but it was more along the lines of fate using Weather Report and Emporio to basically kick Pucci's ass. Or if you really want to put a face on it, I'd say it's more Weather Report than anything else. Since the stand is a representation of the user's soul, it would make sense that the hatred that Weather Report had for Pucci makes for a delicious, tragic irony. However, I do understand where people are coming from when they express that disappointment, but I do think that Jolene and Pucci do act as good foils to each other, and it was because of Jolene's efforts that Emporio was to get his part of fate. Of course, there are some things we can talk about involving Jolene and Pucci. I've always enjoyed looking at both protagonists and antagonists and how they correlate to each other, and I've always stated in these videos that the best way to have a really amazing dynamic with a hero and villain is how they act as foils to each other. As a quick refresher, or if you're not familiar with the term, a foil is basically a character that acts in contrast to another, typically more to highlight the attributes of the main character. To give a quick rundown, Jolene is the daughter of Jotaro Kujo, the man who killed Dio, and she was actually accused of a crime that she did not commit and was thrown into jail because she took the fall for her boyfriend. And already we can see something interesting idea for a foil. Both these characters are inheritors of fate, with Jolene being the daughter of Jotaro and Pucci being a disciple of Dio. These two are tied by fate by the mere fact of their association with characters that we know clash. Now that's not enough to really solidify them as foils, so let's look towards their stands. Jolene's stand, Stone Free, as the name implies, can give Jolene an expansive amount of freedom with her ability to unravel her body into string. Stone Free is a very versatile stand, and with Jolene's imagination, she can put that versatility to the limit. Her stand is literally all about freedom. In contrast, Poochie's White Snake takes away others' freedom, stealing their memories and stand abilities, turning them into empty husks that can't do anything at all. The same can be said with Seamoon's power, which warps the gravity and forces people to go with the gravitational pull is happening. And you can even say the same thing with Made in Heaven, where it's literally trying to enforce that people should accept their fates and become happy with results that they will know about. There's also the relationships that they hold. When they were starting out with Jolene, she holds a lot of resentment for her father, Jotaro. When the two meet up in prison visitation, Jolene is cold and even lays into her father for not being a part of her life. In contrast, when Poochie was going through the worst time in his young life, not only did Dio pop in his head, but also acted as guidance for the young priest in his time of stress. We also get a lot of scenes of Dio having a personal interaction with Poochie, and while Dio was usually seen to be relaxed and polite to his worshippers and underlings, there's a more genuine feel to Dio's attitude with Poochie, as if Dio genuinely respected Poochie as a friend. It comes off as an actual friendship that Dio had with Poochie. It does a great job of humanizing Dio and Poochie as characters, and does a good job of showcasing how Jolene and Poochie had differences with the most important people in their lives, and how their relationships were drastically different. Hell, it wasn't until Poochie had taken Jotaro's stand in memories that Jolene actually started to care for her father and help him out. I understand that a lot of this can come off as a stretch, but again, to me, the issue comes from how the final battle goes the way it does. And while I don't necessarily agree that the final battle in part 6 is falling short, I do understand. Again, I've been there. But I still maintain that there are some elements of being a foil between these two characters, and it does make the interactions and combat between them work more and more. I think Poochie is probably one of the more tragic villains in Jojo, only comparable to that of Dio himself. He's a man who was essentially screwed over by fate, and had he known what was to come before then, he would have been able to brace himself for it. Whether he would fight against that fate, well, it's always a good what-if scenario. To me, Poochie is an interesting villain, especially since he's carrying on the will of Dio in an attempt to reach heaven, and in Poochie's mind, he thought what he was doing would indeed prevent anyone else from going through what he did. And that's the biggest tragedy of all. As Weather Report says, the greatest evil of all is the evil that doesn't realize it is. And it really ties in the idea that no one views themselves as a villain in their own story. I'm not saying that there aren't villains out there who don't view themselves as villains, but Poochie in his mind believes what he's doing is for the greater good.
How can this be for the greater good? Shut it!
Part 6, from what I understand, is a bit of a controversial part, and for good reason, since it was the part that really changed Jojo from what it was, and it did so by resetting the entire universe. Now, whether or not you like the last 3 parts of Jojo, or enjoy the first 6 parts, that's not really up for debate here. I just personally enjoy a tragic villain who, for the most part, was successful in most of his endeavors, but was, ironically enough, defeated by fate itself. Of course, there's one more set of villains that we can talk about, at least in the animated capacity, when it comes to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And I'm sure you all know who those 3 are. I know it's been since February since I last talked about JoJo in a video on its own, so I'll make you guys a deal. If this video manages to get 5,000 likes and we get about 1,000 comments saying, "Next you'll say," I'll gladly put the Pillarman video higher up on the to-do list. Hopefully have it out by September or so. Until then though, I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and remember to count your prime numbers.
Nice!
Jojo!
It has been a long time coming, my friends, and though we've done this in a slipshod order, yeah, I know. It's a crime we're finally talking about the Part 2 JoJo villains, the Pillarmen, in the last animated villains series of videos. But look, when the Kira video is almost at 500,000 views at the time of me recording this, you look me in the eye and you tell me I was wrong to start there. But regardless, it's time to talk about the second group of villains in the JoJo verse, the Pillarmen.
Next words from your mouth are, I'm going to knock that smirk right off of your face. Watch.
I'm going to knock that smirk right off your face! Wait a second, you can't do that! That's my trick!
Frankly speaking, it's not that I don't find the Pillarmen to be interesting villains. In fact, one could even say they're a lot more interesting as the villains than Dio was, because they're more active in the plot of Jojo Part 2. I just personally found it a lot more interesting to talk about the other major Jojo villains first, and while that may sound like a whole condemnation of the characters, I assure you, it isn't. The Pillarmen, at the very least, are fun villains, especially when you consider all three of them as separate characters, each with their own personalities and eccentricities. But enough of me talking. I'm MangaKamen, and it's time to tackle the Pillarmen. After tens of thousands of years before the events of Battle Tendency, there was a race of super beings, highly intelligent, immensely strong, and the ability to manipulate their bodies in extreme ways, such as using their veins to spurt blood or contort their bodies in various forms. They were the pinnacle of world and evolution, with only one weakness: the sun. But there was one member of the Pillarmen who once sought to break the weakness and become the greatest living creature of all time. That man was Kars, the one who decided to develop a means to instill evolution in himself. His method of doing so was to create a stone mask that when blood was exposed onto it, tendrils of stone would erupt and pierce the wearer's brain. On humans, this would turn them into vampires. Honestly, that's a unique way of making it to be a vampire. Acupuncture! It actually makes sense when you think about it. But when the Pillarman wears it, it awakens their abilities and makes them nigh invincible. But with an augmented mask with the red stone of Asia, it could eliminate the one weakness that all Pillarmen had: the sun. Though the prospect of this elated Kars, most of the rest of his race did not approve of this, and they sought to destroy him, since that ambition would create a natural order cataclysm. Kars and his co-conspirator ECDC managed to wipe out all but themselves and two infants of their race, and went out into the world seeking the elusive red stone of Asia to make their dreams come true. For thousands of years, the four traveled the world in search of the stone, but when their efforts became fruitless, they were forced to hibernate, waiting for a time for when the stone could be in their grasp. As villains, it's certainly a bit of a step up from the first incarnation of Jojo's villain. Now, while Dio is a villain that I myself have sung the praises of for his evilness in various videos, there's something to say about the greater scope of things. What I mean to say is that if you really were to think about it, without the Pillarmen, there wouldn't actually be a story to the world of Jojo, because without the creation of the stone masks, Dio wouldn't have become a vampire, and therefore wouldn't have the entire series set in motion. And it's not like the Pillarmen thought ahead to do this. This is mostly just a byproduct of their experimentations with the masks on humans. It has this odd feeling to it when you really think about it. Like how you're told that humans are harming the earth through our own means of progress with technology, and that the byproducts of that have an after effect on our world. It makes it appropriate for Araki to have designed them as they were in that regard, because it gives them an air of higher beings, almost like gods of sorts. As he himself said, that's why I based the four of their appearances, including Saviento, on Roman statues, Egyptian sphinxes, and the Japanese Neo statues, to give them a strange physical beauty as godlike figures in organic form. And it makes sense. The Pillarmen are global threats, not only for their insane abilities, but for the fact that they have the ability to eat people simply by touching them, and don't even have to be aware of doing it. Hell, as demonstrated through the pages of the manga and the anime itself, the moment that Kars does gain the ability to break his limitation, not only is he able to evolve insanely quick to any situation, but he can't even be taken down by the sun or even the series power system at the time. Hamon or Ripple, depending on which one floats your boat. It's interesting to think about, stacking the odds so heavily against your protagonist who, let's face it, is just a snot-nosed, cocky British American teenager with a knack of being super out there.
You're it!
Really puts things into perspective when you think about it. Though it's not unheard of in stories that you have a plucky youth fighting against the ancient evil that is super powerful and could crush him in an instant if they wanted to, and he has to rely on his wits to get out of the situations. And it doesn't hurt that the three are at the very least compelling villains with their own personalities and quirks. But at the same time, each of them are an established threat in their own regard as well, and it makes each of them stand out from each other. Though before we get to their personalities, we should discuss their goals a little bit more, for the fact that their desire to become the ultimate life forms.
I am the ultimate life form.
And who doesn't want to strive to be that? Especially when there's only one thing stopping you, and that's the sun. It's honestly a simple goal, but one with massive repercussions that could have on the entirety of the human race, since we just become a 24-hour, all-you-can-eat buffet for the Pillarmen. But let's actually talk about them as characters, shall we?
Choose your character.
Before we continue, I think it's appropriate to state that I'm not going to be talking about Satana or Saviento in depth in this video. It's not because I think he's a bad villain, but it's because even Cars himself likens the guy as a guard dog. And since we've got about 3 other characters to discuss for this, I'd rather not kill myself by adding a 4th to the discussion.
This is fucking tragic. Look at yourself.
Each of the Pillarmen have their own personalities and views on things such as honor, and it makes it at the very least compelling to see them interact with the exuberant Joseph Joestar, who is also probably one of the more expressive and out there Jojo protagonists.
Run for your life! Oh man, I knew you were gonna do that!
Note to self, do video on Joseph Joestar. Tell audience if they want me to do that. Give this video 5k likes. Sorry about that. Let's consider each of the Pillarmen individually, starting with Wamu. Out of the 3 Pillarmen, Wamu was obviously the most honorable member of the trio. A true warrior who respects the acts of bravery, even from lowly humans. Probably one of the best examples would have to be...
これはまさかこれはシーザーのバンダナそしてピアスワムーのピアスだ
After his fight with Caesar, Wamu could have easily popped the bubble of blood by the secondary protagonist Caesar. Inside was Caesar's iconic headband along with an antidote that Joseph needed. In all honesty, had he popped the bubble and taken care of it at the time, Wamu wouldn't have lost his duel against Joseph later on.
You see the bandana? All the pieces flying around?
Every little fragment is still on fire, and they're entering my body.
Wamu, you have been a worthy and admirable fighter. But a powerful ally named Caesar was with me throughout this contest.
Wamu as a character, and even more so as a villain, is an interesting case, especially for the Jojo verse. Typically when you look at Jojo villains, most of the time they don't join up with the main protagonists on their journey. Araki will make them out to be the scummiest scumbags, and will often get what's coming to them. But Wamu doesn't really fit that mold, so he stands out. He's a noble warrior who saw combat as an honorable sport, and when his ego gets in the way, he accepts punishment from his opponents, as shown when fighting against Joseph in the first time they met.
Almost sounded like you said go ahead and retrieve your weapon, which would be ridiculous. I mean, why would you retrieve something that comes right back to you?
If anything, the concept of honor is a hindrance to not only Wamu, but his 2 masters, Cars and AC/DC, as he had the ability and chance to ultimately kill Joseph Joestar really early.
Yielding in the moments before your death. Is it because you have bricks for brains, or do you still have another trick for me?
Do you really want to know?
Actually, no. Let me guess. Because you're so obviously clever, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you wouldn't be stupid enough to be holding a stick of dynamite behind your back.
Damn, he's on to me!
And I know you wouldn't insult my intelligence by thinking you could quickly throw the brake and send the minecart flying off the tracks. Maybe like this!
But Wamu's honor got in the way of eliminating the annoying pest that was Joseph. Again, most villains in JoJo don't really have that scrap of honor to them. A lot of them tend to be pretty big monsters with varying degrees of psychopathy or messed up natures to them. And while that's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, since a lot of the JoJo villains, especially the weekly fodder, tend to be as deep as a puddle when it comes to death, Wamu stands out since while he is on the evil side, wanting to aid Cars and AC/DC, he does have a sense of honor. And instead of killing Joseph Joestar, Wamu instead does something different. To ensure that Joseph can back up his words of a challenge, Wamu proposes to Joseph.
Say hello to the wedding ring of death. Guess where it goes? A hint, not on your finger.
What are you doing with that?
This ring will start to dissolve in 33 days. It's impossible to remove, and once dissolved, it will release a virulent poison.
Any attempt to remove or damage it will also release the lethal poison.
It's always the ball and chain that gets the good ones. In order to remove the poisonous ring, Jojo needs to defeat and acquire the lip ring from Wamu to survive or he'll die. Again, this is due to Wamu's honor that he holds. And while Jojo could have taken the antidote he received from Caesar, there was also something stopping him. It's the same reason why Joseph does this.
What is going on?
Roy Caesar's bubble of blood that carried his bandana and ring, knowing full well that they posed a serious threat to you. Was that pity?
It was because the man was a worthy and noble warrior. He deserved to be honored for that.
What you'll say next is, Jojo, you can't mean.
Jojo, you can't mean.
The honor you showed my friend, Caesar's warrior spirit, had earned your respect. So in return, I wanted to find a way to honor your warrior spirit. My blood is a tribute to you.
Even though we see the power that Wamu is capable of, he still had some redeeming qualities, his honor and the respect he showed to worthy adversaries. And that alone is something that makes Wamu stand out from not only the Pillarmen, but the Jojo villain roster too. That isn't to say the other Pillarmen don't have their own unique bells and whistles. AC/DC doesn't hold the same code of honor that Wamu does, but he does hold respect for Wamu's decision to allow Jojo to live, which does indicate that he holds some level of regard to his fellow Pillarmen's decisions, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have his own tricks.
I hope you didn't think your paltry tricks would help you escape, human. I don't imagine the two of us will fight, but just in case, here's a gift for you. One that fits perfectly around your windpipe!
Which, considering at the point in time with the power system in Jojo, which was Ripple or Hamon, it's a devastating handicap to Jojo, mainly because to use the power of Hamon, you need to have a mastery of your breathing, and with that ring limiting Jojo's breathing power, it would hold him back. AC/DC isn't as honorable as Wamu is, since this guy does love pulling underhanded tricks, most notably...
Slept right for weeks!
Huh?
I just can't take it! I just can't take it!
What the hell is this?
Ah yes, nothing like psyching out your opponent then using your own veins of boiling blood to set up a trap while your opponent is confused about everything. Out of the three Pillarmen, AC/DC is shown to be the craftiest and possibly even the most intelligent of them, especially since he's able to get ahead of Jojo in planning strategy, even showcasing that he's even able to read Jojo's mind and thoughts. Well, not actual mind reading, but...
Smiling again, I don't like it! What are you laughing about this time?
The next words from your mouth are, I'm going to knock that smirk right off of your face. Watch.
I'm going to knock that smirk right off your face! Wait a second, you can't do that! That's my trick!
It should be noted that AC/DC does hold some respect for Jojo. There are multiple times that he remarks that Jojo did improve greatly in the span of less of a month, meaning he's willing to acknowledge positive traits of his opponents, while AC/DC is the first one to fall of the three that shouldn't discount his personality. And finally we have Cars, and to be honest, he's a bit harder to pin down, since we don't get a lot about what Cars actually is, especially since he tends to be a bit of a contradictory character. What I mean by that is there seems to be a hint of love for the natural world, where there are two notable events. The first is when he kills a couple of drunks who are driving recklessly that would kill a dog and even wounding himself to protect a bunch of flowers. But then...
Gets his hands on the red stone. First thing he does is make a squirrel.
Yeah, that just gets thrown out the window. And that's not the only thing to really say that's contradictory about the character. While at first it seems that he is as honorable as his fellow Pillarmen, even at one point proclaiming that he'll avenge their deaths, another Pillarman, Santana, was just considered a guard dog, despite the fact that he was raised by Cars and AC/DC like Wamu was. Cars tends to flip-flop when it suits him and his ideals, and it doesn't help that he's pretty much a poster boy for the mysterious and vague villain trope that would be used by other Jojo villains. It's why, despite Cars being the leader of the Pillarmen and obviously the final boss of Part 2, he's a bit harder to pin down as a character, especially since he's willing to go back on his word, being sadistic and playing dirty. Such as getting his hands on the Red Stone of Asia, where he had accepted a duel against the mentor character of the show, Lisa, and before their match could even begin, he struck her down so he'd get his hands on the stone that would induce his evolution. But that does mean that each Pillarman feels unique in having their own character, and while Cars is a bit more confusing to pin down, you can always say one thing about these villains: they're a bunch of hams.
Down, 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 down.
Which, if you know anything about me, I love it when the villains can be entertaining while at the same time showing off how demented they can be. Of course, when we talk about villains, we need to talk about them as a threat. I've always stated that a villain needs to be a threat to the main characters, and it should be obvious since they're supposed to care for the fact that if these three were allowed to roam unchecked, well... we'd be on the menu. Yummy. And again, they can do this with a simple touch, and they don't even have to be conscious about doing it.
Mark! Get out of there now! No!
That alone was quite gruesome, and this isn't just humans that can face this terrible fate, but vampires as well, as demonstrated with Santana devouring one quite easily. The Pillarmen each have unique abilities though, all awakened by the stoned mass that allows them to completely control their bodies, and at the very least allows each of them to stand out from each other. Wamu possesses an ability called Wind Mode, which allows him to manipulate the wind around him and blow from his body. Not in that way. This is highlighted in two of the more standout techniques, his Divine Sandstorm and the Windsuit. Divine Sandstorm is produced by having his forearms spin rapidly, creating a pair of massive windstorms that can rip people asunder. And his Windsuit is a more tactical technique, where he uses the steam from his body to release air from the lungs, which covers him in, well, a suit of wind, which not only gives him the ability to essentially become invisible, but also reflect the suns off his body so he can be outside in the day, although it can only last for 10 seconds since it takes a lot of energy to maintain. He does have one more technique, and it's a bit of a last resort. The Atmospheric Rift, where he unleashes a powerful compressed burst of air from his horn, but has a lot of drawbacks as it can tear his body apart from the heat and scrape from the wind compression. AC/DC, meanwhile, has manipulation as well for his body, but has a far more dangerous technique in my opinion, and that's his Flame Mode, which he can heat up his body's blood to 500 degrees Celsius, and by hurling it out of his body, it can melt anything it touches. Not to mention, because of his awakened control, he can control his blood vessels to shoot out the blood from various degrees, angles, and even locations. It sounds simple, but considering his fight with Jojo on the spikes, he's able to have them weave around terrain and spurt blood wherever he wants. And to top it off, he actually met a Chinese military general, Sun Tzu, and learned about the art of war. Quite literally, since he is the author of the famous Art of War, which was devoted to military strategy and tactics that have been used since the early 5th century BC. So what I'm saying is, AC/DC has got that big brain going on and he knows how to use it. And finally, we have Cars, and whoo boy, does he have a lot. Well, let's start with his standard ability, which allows him to create bladed appendages on his arms and legs that are covered in tiny shark-like teeth claws that move about like a chainsaw, which allows him to cut pretty much anything like moving cars and even slice up bullets. But that is nothing in comparison for when he actually acquires his goal of becoming the ultimate life form.
I am the ultimate life form. I go wherever I want.
No, he doesn't get chaos control, though there was one point where Cars did gain the ability to teleport. Not sure how he did that though, but regardless, when he becomes the ultimate life form, Cars gains the DNA of every organism to ever live on Earth. What this means is that he can manipulate his body to the cellular level to gain traits of any life form, like turning his hand into a squirrel, or grow wings, or turn the feathers from those wings into metal-eating piranhas, or even have the ability to use Hamon, even at a skilled level greater than anyone else in the series. Cars becomes a literal god on Earth, someone who is able to survive even a volcano's heat. One could even argue that Joseph didn't need to defeat Cars, it was all because of a series of stupid events that set Cars to his demise. Not that he would know that.
I just got lucky, but thinking I outsmarted him will drive Cars nuts.
It took an even greater god to take out Cars, and that god is named Araki. I joke, but I do find a bit of a great irony that it took an action that not even Jojo planned that would lead to the Earth outright rejecting the greatest life form it produced, making the Pillar Man become nothing more than a piece of useless space junk that wished for death until his mind eroded into nothing. But back to the main point of this section, the Pillarmen are obviously a dangerous threat. Combined with their personalities, they at the very least provide a challenge for Jojo that he needed to overcome.
What's a guy gotta do to get a little food in here?
Cars! One thing I love to do when I talk about villains in this series is compare them to the main character and how well they act as foils for the respective protagonists. And to some degree, I think all three members of the Pillarmen do act as foils for Joseph Joestar. And while I do want to dedicate an actual video to Joseph, I do think we need to describe him in order to actually deep dive into how I think each of them provide as different foils for the main character.
Wait, what's this about? You're all staring as though you've seen a ghost. I know it's a funeral and all, huh? What the? What's my name doing on there? I'm alive and well!
Joseph Joestar in his prime is honestly one of the goofier protagonists of the Jojo series. What with him willing to do some over-the-top stunts to fulfill his goals, cross-dressing, using a Tommy gun to fight a vampire, and running away from said vampire. He's also not above using crafty tricks to outsmart his opponents, since he does have a love for the art of misdirection.
Let's play. Sure, but I was still able to pull one over on you, wasn't I? And you should take a look at the grenade you just knocked away.
You son of a...
Now, obviously we look towards the Pillarmen, they do have contrasting correlation with Joseph. Once again, we're starting with Wamu. Wamu, as we discussed, is a warrior of honor, and he tends to be very straightforward with his attacks. Hell, it's because of that he's able to see right through some of Joseph's tricks.
Actually, no. Let me guess. Because you're so obviously clever, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you wouldn't be stupid enough to be holding a stick of dynamite behind your back.
Damn, he's on to me!
And I know you wouldn't insult my intelligence by thinking you could quickly throw the brake and send the minecart flying off the tracks. Maybe like this!
Granted, that straightforwardness and warrior's pride is what allows Joseph to actually read the character of Wamu and convince the warrior to spare him so he could train further. And when the two actually do fight, Jojo does gain some level of respect for Wamu, who, as I also brought up before, could have easily popped the blood bubble left by Caesar. And while Jojo does have respect for Caesar because of the action he took to get the antidote, I like to think that Joseph did gain respect for Wamu's warrior spirit during their fight, allowing Joseph to evolve and learn from him. Then we have AC/DC. I think it's pretty obvious as to why you can compare the two as foils.
Plans, aren't you? Oof, you went pale, Jojo. Did I hit the mark? Was I anywhere close to the bullseye?
Both of the characters are a bit more of tricksters and are actively trying to one-up each other in battle with their strategies, even going so far as to use misdirection to win. Joseph and AC/DC even use similar techniques to gain the upper hand in combat, and while both of them use misdirection as a weapon, playing deeper and deeper, I would argue that neither one of them are what you would call dishonest.
Lovely birthday cake covered in candles flickering with their merry little red flames.
He's on a knife's edge! He's not going to make it!
Caesar! Judging from what I can see, we have to assume that Logs has been killed. If Jojo is not the one to survive, we will be the ones AC/DC will come after next. Jojo is too far away for us to be able to help him now. I know it's painful, but right now we have to think about protecting...
Because there is a difference between deception and lying. Deception is making someone believe something is false, and lying is specifically telling someone something else. It's a small difference, but one I think is more important to establish, especially when we look towards Cars, who represents the lying aspect. Because while Cars puts on a brave front, much like how Jojo does, such as saying he respects a warrior's pride, when it comes to his goals of evolution, he's quick to throw it out, as showcased when he attacks Lisa to get the Red Stone of Asia. And while Jojo is a fan of deceptive tactics, Cars is certainly not above that as well, even using hostages to get what he wants, even throwing aside the pride of the Pillarmen too. To me, the Pillarmen act as foils for Jojo since they also represent a part of Joseph's personality, and in some cases take it to an extreme. Now, I could be reading way too much into that, but hey, I'm just giving my opinion on the matter and it's fun to do this sort of thing, you know? It's really telling about the series of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure when you consider the scale of things. Like, the Pillarmen really are bigger than the world itself. When you consider the first villain in in JoJo, Dio Brando, a poor kid who would turn into a vampire who would return in part 3, Araki really raised the stakes with these 3 villains. But it always raises an interesting question. How do you top a character like Cars? I mean, in the idea of him being a threat, you've got a being who can basically adapt to any situation on Earth. Keywords there being on Earth, mind you. When you boil it down, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure really has to live up to its name of being bizarre, because when the Pillarmen were toppled over, the villains afterwards not only had to be given completely different power system to work, but they also had to top the bizarre concepts that the Pillarmen were. With the Pillarmen, you had these ancient godlike beings with strange body powers, with one of them essentially becoming a god, and yet the escalation of villains kept going. Following this, we would be bringing back the first villain, only this time he has the ability to stop time, then a serial killer who had the hand fetish developed when he saw the Mona Lisa, who also has the ability to turn anything into a bomb and could rewind time, a mafioso with multiple personalities and a paranoid behavior who can erase chunks of time at will, a priest who not only has a thing for prime numbers but was so enthralled with the bisexual vampire of the first and third chapters that he was willing to get to heaven, which meant resetting the universe by pressing the fast forward button on the world. And what came after all that? Why, the President of the United States, who's a dimension hopper, somehow lost a ton of weight in a single manga panel and is trying to collect the pieces of Jesus Christ's corpse. And after saying all that, I feel like I took some sort of illegal drug and I'm high on something. I'm sure my neighbors who heard that are going, "Oh boy, the Java freak next door is acting like a weirdo again. Probably thinks the President of the United States is a dimension hopper again." And all of that just makes me smile, because that's the kind of series this is, you know? Because when you really think about it, the Pillarmen are honestly kind of mundane in comparison to the other JoJo villains. They have a lot more of a typical villain shonen traits that people go, "Oh yeah, that's anime, alright." Because of all the weirdness of their abilities and the JoJo brand of wackiness, they really do represent what it means to be a JoJo villain, because they set the groundwork for what would come after. Let's see, Battle Hensi was penned in 1987 to 1989, that's about 38 years, like hot damn. 38 years. But yeah, I think the Pillarmen are great villains, and if you enjoyed this video and wish for me to talk about Joseph Joestar, please put down in the comments, "Next you'll say!" And if we reach 5k likes in this video, I'll gladly do it. But until next time, my friends, I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and arrivederci!